The History Things podcast is brought to you by TR Historical, your one-stop shop for all your historical fan gear needs. Visit trhistorical.com and use the promo code HISTORYTHINGS to receive 10% off your next purchase. Thanks for listening. Now let's start the show.
Are you ready?
What's up, everybody, and welcome to the History Things podcast, episode 1. I'm your host, Pat McGuire, and joining me today and every day here on the show is my great friend and your co-host, Matt Borders. Matty B, how the hell are you today, buddy?
Doing good, man. How are you? You sound a little froggish today.
Yeah, we, the 1-year-old gave me a little bit of the kid plague, and it beat up my vocal cords. It decimated them, which coincidentally, I just found out today, decimated is actually an ancient Roman term.
Just found that out?
Awesome. I study other things, but I just found that out. So cool, a little history thing tying into my crappy voice. But we're going to get through it as best we can today. But yeah, thanks for pointing out that I sound like absolute doo-doo, buddy. Love it. So what have you been up to, man? It's been a few weeks since I've seen you last. What are you working on? How's the winter going?
Winter's being productive as best it can be. I just had a great program that we did with our mutual friend and colleague there, John Heckman, the tattooed historian.
Yeah, you did a great job, man.
I appreciate that. Up in Gettysburg on the Tattooed Historian Presents, so that was a lot of fun. Been getting the book out there as best I can, working on some other writing projects, some I can't talk about right now, but we will in the future. And of course, top secret, that's right. And of course, that transcription project that you and I have been talking about for a while. So,
absolutely. When are we going to see you next? What's the next time we have a Matt Borders public offering? What's the next public move for Matty B?
Actually, my next one's coming up Tuesday. I'll be at the Baltimore Civil War Roundtable.
Cool. So by the time this airs, that'll obviously come and gone.
Right.
But for all future things, by the time you're listening to this, you can keep up with what Matt's doing at Matt Borders Books on Instagram and obviously on History Things with Pat. I try to do my best to promote everything Matt's doing. So even though by the time this airs, you will have missed that event, make sure you're just keeping track from this point going forward, because we just want to support the good work you're doing, buddy. Matt, you're pretty brilliant. So today we are going to be talking about a very special topic, sort of right up in our wheelhouses, professionally right in your wheelhouse.
Yep.
What are we talking about today, Matt?
We're going to be looking at the Maryland Campaign, Pat. The 1862 Maryland Campaign.
So Robert E. Lee's first invasion of the North.
That's right. And like you said, this is right up in my wheelhouse. I was a ranger there at Antietam for a little while. Actually, first interned there, then a ranger, and then, which fits in very well with our guest today, became a guide, one of the certified battlefield guides in 2012.
So that's a perfect point. It's a great opportunity to bring up our guest today. So with us to help tell the story of the Maryland Campaign is another certified guide colleague of yours at the battlefield. As the author of several books. He works down in Prince William County doing a lot of their Civil War history, and he's a pretty good guy, and unfortunately for him, he's a Buffalo Bills fan. But we are going to introduce to the show, episode 1, our very first guest, ladies and gentlemen, Kevin Pawlak. How you doing, man?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you for having me. I too have now learned that decimated comes from ancient Rome. I did not know that either.
Yeah,
am I the only one that knew that?
Matt is you've lost that
nerd.
Fight. Yeah, I did not know that. So
yeah,
learning something new already.
Yeah, I know. That's what we want to do. We want to aspire to teach. So. Kevin, thanks for coming on the show, man. I've read a bunch of your books. You're a fantastic writer. I spent a lot of time down in Prince William County. Obviously, I do a lot of volunteering at Manassas National Battlefield, and I've been over to Bristow Station a bunch and stuff like that. So I really like the work you guys are doing down there. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about who you are, sort of what makes you Kevin Pawlak?
Oh gosh, what makes me Kevin Pawlak?
Actually, don't go too deep.
Yeah,
That could get really weird, really fast.
Philosophically,
The inside story.
Yes, that's right. Never before heard. No, history is my thing. I mean, obviously that's why we're here. But that's both my occupation, thankfully, and it's my passion. It's my hobby. What I do, Maryland Campaign specifically. But I just got into the Civil War when I was a youngster, 9 years old. My family, I like to say, took me on the, every American family has to take the trip to Gettysburg once in their lives. My family did that, and probably unfortunately for them, it became an annual occurrence, at least.
Kevin's origin story and mine are creepily similar.
Yes.
Mine is,
and we've discussed this before,
yes,
actually.
I feel weird
true.
that I have the same story, but it's not Gettysburg. Mine was Harper's Ferry.
Oh,
Like I had the
okay.
same
you
experience,
got a +1 on
but
us
we
for
went
that.
to Harper's Ferry.
At least you're in the Maryland campaign.
That's right. Yeah,
True,
no,
we're involved.
that's yeah, absolutely. So, so I came down here for school from Western New York, like you said, got away from the snow. Even though I love the snow,
Yeah, I
but
love the snow too.
snow doesn't bother me.
Yeah.
So this winter hasn't been very fun.
No.
But
We don't have good winters in Maryland. We suck.
yeah, exactly. So I went to Shepherd University, studied history, of course, Civil War concentration, and it's been, this area hasn't gotten rid of me as much as they've tried.
What
in
brought
some
you to write
cases.
your first book? As somebody I've always aspired to maybe write a book. How'd you get there?
My first book that I wrote, I guess back in 2015, about Shepherdstown's experience during the Maryland campaign, the experience of the town itself mostly as a Confederate hospital. That was not intended to be my first book. Interestingly enough,
I'm familiar with that idea.
Yes, yeah, and when I was looking at Shepherd University, where I ended up going to a couple of months before, I think it'd been my first visit there, out in Civil War Times, there was an article about just basically a 2-page tour guide to Shepherdstown. I'd never heard of the Shepherdstown battlefield before. So I went down there, wanted to check it out with my parents, and at the time there was really nothing there to talk about this battle or anything like that. There's one book that Tom McGrath had written,
Right.
and I read it, really enjoyed it, but I thought there was more to the story. So I started compiling a lot of research on Shepherdstown, and initially the topic of the book was supposed to be one chapter in that book, and then I realized that it probably deserved its own story
Wow.
instead, so it kind of morphed into that, and since then my Battle of Shepherdstown book has been on the back burner for other projects,
I hear
unfortunately.
ya.
But I want to get it done right. So.
Well, if you're gonna do something, do it right. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
absolutely.
Where can we catch you next? What are you doing now? And when's the next time we can catch you out in the world? As you doing speaking stuff? What are you doing?
I also will be doing Tuesday night for Historic Prince William, talking about some of the research we've been doing at one of my sites, Ben Lomond, which was a Confederate field hospital following First Manassas. And then I'll be speaking the end of February, I forget the exact date, in Hagerstown.
Oh, right on.
Roundtable.
Nice.
Nice.
On a topic that's near and dear to all of our hearts, and that Matt has done a lot of good research on, the Loudon Valley campaign.
Yeah,
Yes.
love that Loudon Valley.
Yeah, so I know you guys will be talking about that in the future, I understand.
Yeah,
so
very
I'm always
excited.
out and about.
Yeah, you gotta give some love to the Loudon Valley campaign.
Yeah,
It's one of
probably not
those-
many people even know what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's one of those, and that's a shame, right? If you are listening, and
Half
you
of the
don't
people
know,
who know it.
if you don't know what we're talking about, you're gonna get a pretty good lesson on it on our second episode installment with Avery Lentz when we get into the Fredericksburg storyline. But as a whole, I just want to put it out there. If you don't know about it, you should. It's a major direct setup for the Battle of Fredericksburg. You can't get into it unless you understand the Loudon campaign. So we're not here for that today. Just trust me. Follow up on that later, but get into it. It's something you should know. So today we are going to get down into the nitty gritty of the Maryland campaign. Matt, tell us a little bit about your thoughts on where does the Maryland campaign rank, in your opinion, amongst some of the other great campaigns in American history?
Well, it's a great question because there are so many campaigns that we could look at in all of history, all of U.S. history, but the Maryland campaign is the defining campaign of the country. As long as you're outside of the Revolutionary War, which makes the country, the Maryland campaign is really what puts us on the path that we've been on since the Civil War. It's the campaign that will begin the real process of making America that we know, the America that we have today. It's going to begin to change the entire focus of the American Civil War, as we know, due to the results of this campaign.
Right. So I completely agree with you, and that's why I think this is a topic that gets explored a lot. It is the very easy number two to Gettysburg in the war in the East in terms of stories we hear quite often. But I don't think that this is a story that even though you're hearing it often and overdone all the time, like it's not actually overdone. We can't explore this topic enough because it's literally shaping the world we're all living in. The room that we're sitting in, the house that we're all sitting in, the world we all live in was all affected by this military campaign that played out over the spring and summer of 1862. So where do we start though in a story that is that big and has that much consequence to it? There's two ways we can approach it. We're all minutia guys, so we can get hammered in the weeds of this and start all the way back and like imagine stories like the Missouri Compromise and stuff like that. We can take it back.
1820. Let's go.
But we're not going to do that for mostly your sakes as the listeners. So what I like to do is kind of pick it up around August of 1861 because some of the players that we're going to be talking about are coming into the fold, into the scene in different ways. And what I want to start with is actually George McClellan. George Brenton McClellan is going to be named commander of this newly formed Army of the Potomac in August of 1861. And so
he's the commander that historians and the modern public loves to hate.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that Matt and I conversationally try to do just as a fun little challenge and an exercise on like making sure we're being, as unbiased and true to the fact as historians as we try to do this shtick where we are, McClellan haters defending McClellan. It's a weird world to try to do that. But there's been a book published recently, forgive me, hit me with the author, Stottlemyre. Stephen Stottlemyre wrote it.
Yep.
Does a really good job sort of readdressing some of these notions we have about McClellan, and it's sort of if you have an open mind, it forces you to take a look at and be maybe less critical of some of the things that McClellan does or doesn't do, rather. But very simple fact, you're not off the hook, little Mac, right? You're still kind of a turd, but no, love you, buddy. But what we have here is a very promising commander who is rising into this command of this new army. So a couple things. One, you got to remember the AOP hasn't been around. Army of Potomac, the AOP hasn't been around for the first Manassas fights or any of the quote phony war phases of the war where we kind of are just positioning along the Potomac and staring at each other. Everybody's trying to figure out what the hell just happened at First Manassas and what's going to happen next. Right. So it's not a lot going on, but we've got this guy coming into the command of this new army, and he's I guess a hotshot's a good way to describe him. He's got a lot of promise behind him. He'd been in the Army for a while, had a really promising career. George McClellan's a West Pointer. He'd been an American observer in some foreign wars, the Crimea most notably, where he comes back with a lot of the lessons that he'll implement in the American Civil War. For those of you equestrian folk out there, horse riders, the McClellan saddle, if you were unaware, he designed it. And the government loved it, the military loved it because of its economic simplicity. It was a cheap saddle to make, and it worked really well for the Army's purposes. So they could make a lot of it without spending a lot of money on it. And the military loved that. So he comes into command of this army, and this army is being formed with new soldiers. Remember, the beginning of the war, we have 3-month enlistments, and a lot of these are expiring, and they're going home. And so we need to have a new army made with longer than 3 months. Lincoln knows he can't keep doing this every 3 months. So we got to end this rebellion or win the war. We got to get it done like right away and as quickly as possible, but we can't bet on that happening. So we got to make sure people stay. So boom, here come 3-year enlistments. And we have thousands of men coming through the nation's capital, today Washington, D.C., but then we're calling it Washington City. And at the height of this sort of mass exodus of troops that are coming in and building this army, we're going to have tens of thousands of troops coming in sometimes a week. It's a pretty hopping place. And much like it is today, it was really nasty and hot and humid. And that city was less built up than it is now. It was a hot, nasty, swampy mess. So try to imagine a hot, nasty swamp with tens of thousands of guys and troops and poor sanitation and stuff. DC was a weird place to be at that time. But the other guy that we're going to sort of juxtapose this against is General Robert E. Lee. He's not out in the field, or is he, right? That's one of the things I'll ask you guys to clarify in a minute here is, in August of 1861, he's not in command of what is known as the Army of Virginia. He's not even fighting in Northern Virginia. Matt, tell us a little bit about where Robert E. Lee is. And Kevin, I don't know if you have any thoughts on sort of where we're at in 1861, but when Matt's done sort of telling us about where Lee is at this time, I would love to hear some perspectives on sort of the heading into 1862 climate.
Now, as we know, Lee had been offered command of the 1st Federal Field Army. He had decided not to take that. Instead, he had gone with his home state of Virginia. And so he has been in Virginia this whole time. In fact, he has been around Richmond quite a bit. He was made a brigadier general for the state of Virginia initially, and eventually that'll transfer into the Confederacy as well.
Does that happen automatically with Virginia's sort of joining the Confederacy, or does that happen like separately from the state's actions? Is that just an automatic, or?
He was a brigadier under the state of Virginia first, and then when Virginia joins the Confederacy, they roll over a lot of Virginia's command into
the upper echelons of
right,
the Confederate
structure. Correct. He is going to be in Richmond for much of this time. He is trying to run the show for what's going on in what we now know as West Virginia, but was Western Virginia at that time. From Richmond, he's sending a lot of telegraphs out to his commanders in the western part of the state, trying to deal with the guy we were just talking about, George McClellan.
Right. Before he's the AOP commander, McClellan is out in Western Virginia. Yep. And it's pretty ironic that in early 1861 we're going to have two heavyweights fighting in a pretty lightweight kind of fight.
Right.
Kind of off the grid, so to speak, from the rest of the action.
Now, he's also going to be involved with some early fortification building. He is a engineer by training. He's going to be building up fortifications or helping with fortification development along the coastline. He'd been involved with that before the war. He's going to add his expertise to that when the war breaks out. And of course, he is the military advisor to Jefferson Davis.
Now, we got a Robert E. Lee fort right here in Maryland. Do you guys know that?
Baltimore.
Yeah, we got a Robert E. Lee built fort right under the Key Bridge. So if you're on I don't know
Fort
if it's
Carroll,
695.
right?
Yeah, Fort Carroll.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly it. Which not a lot of people know about, which I think is pretty cool. And I hope not a lot of people know about that in some weird way, considering all things with the state of history right now. Like, people might come after that cool fort, which, you know what, at this point,
I don't think you can get there.
The city of Baltimore has abandoned that fort, so nothing worse than that can happen to it at this point. But so anyway, I just wanted to throw that in there that he is an engineer, and we have some local ties to that here in the state of Maryland.
That is going to, with him being the military advisor to Jefferson Davis, that's going to kind of put him puts him very close to the seat of power and a general idea of what's going on for the defense of Virginia itself. Because, Kevin, who's running the army for Virginia at this time?
For the state of Virginia?
For Confederate forces in Virginia by this point.
Joseph Johnston.
Exactly.
And PGT Beauregard, you could say.
So what is the state of things then in sort of like, let's say, August of 1861? Like, what's the climate, the war climate as a whole? Like, what's sort of the situation at hand?
For the Federal Army, of course, the disaster at Bull Run, I think, is still hanging heavily over their heads. McClellan in August of 1861 is still in his honeymoon period,
certainly,
so to speak, and so I think he's getting a lot of grace with his idea of wanting to make this army of all these volunteers coming in with new enlistments, make it into a professional army. But I think pretty quickly that grace period is going to run out on McClellan as there's more and more of a push for a drive on Richmond by McClellan and the Union Army, and McClellan is going to continually say that the Army's not ready at this point, as he's drafting and developing a plan that he believes is better than just storming the Confederate works outside of Centerville and Manassas in Northern Virginia. And so that's what's going to bring into the spring 62 campaigns.
So what's going on the other side of the football there? We have this federal effort to build up a force, and this, which we'll cover in a minute here, this kind of like, urgency to get it moving. So what's happening on the other side of the football? What's going on in Richmond and the Confederacy?
I think, to put it pretty simply, dysfunction is happening with the Confederate Army in Northern Virginia. Joseph Johnston is having trouble, starting to get into a troublesome relationship with his commander-in-chief, Jefferson Davis. Beauregard is having the same issues. And at this point in the war, the Confederate plan, the strategy really across the board, was to try to defend as much of the Confederacy as possible,
Right.
So that there weren't any Union incursions in. And that meant that the Confederacy was holding, or Beauregard and Johnston's army would be relied upon to hold Northern Virginia. But it was a position that Johnston especially didn't like. He believed it could be easily turned. Supplies coming up from Richmond was difficult and troublesome to get to the armies. And Johnston and Beauregard both believed there was no chance of them taking Washington, so why remain that close? But it did keep up pressure on the federal government to have it. At one point, there are Confederate troops that are within sight of the Capitol in the fall of 1861.
So we're really getting to the here we go moment. Like, we're all buckling up the seatbelts, and now we're at the top of the hill, and the roller coaster's about to go. So that's pretty interesting time probably of this war, where I liken moments of great change in war to this like deep breath before something happens, kind of like everything right before Operation Overlord or things like that. There's just like this moment where everybody on both sides is like, because they know what's coming. Like the troops on the Western Front, that after the barrage clears, both sides that are there, they know. So we're having a larger scale version of that, because it doesn't play out over minutes or hours. It plays out over weeks, days, and unfortunately for McClellan and everybody, or unfortunately for everybody else that's waiting on McClellan, sometimes it takes months to get going. So that's sort of what happens, right? We roll over the year in 1862. This army's been building and training, and you got to think of what they're doing in Washington City or D.C., as I will interchangeably call them now, just to make sure you're following along and not thinking of some different city. Is they're basically going through what is basic training. Learning the school of the soldier, the manual of arms, how to load and fire, how to march. This is probably one of the most important things. It's maybe even more important than loading and firing, is learning how to move as an army, maneuvering in large groups of men. You got to think, none of these guys, like you said, Army of Volunteers, none of these guys are professional military. They were 80% of the Union Army is farmers.
Right.
So, and that's not just a unique to the Union side of this war. I mean, almost everybody in the nation at this time is a farmer. We're still a very agricultural society. So we're not, this whole concept of everybody in the North works in a factory and everybody in the South owns a slave and is in the field as a farmer is ridiculous. The Union and the Confederacy, if you conversationally put them as separate, are very similar. There is industrial capabilities in the South, and there is agricultural in the South, and there is industrial and agricultural in the North. So,
right.
So we are very much in the same boat. That's where that famous, they are green, but we're green too, or whatever kind of thing. It's like everybody's kind of just not a professional. And then little complete sidebar, I was thinking, as you said, volunteer, and how it plays out with the modern military and everything, what an effect Napoleon had on the world with just creating this citizen army, this volunteer, this army of the people, instead of just having these small professionals. Like, everybody does that. He changed the game for almost every major military in the world.
Yeah.
And and when the Civil War is playing out, we're only like 50-ish or so years after that. So we're right in the thick of those lessons being intimately learned. And I thought that was pretty powerful. So it's like January now of 1862, right? Where we've got this army, it's been training, and people have wanted it to move. And a lot of this impatience isn't really coming from the political leadership. A lot of this impatience, and it is, I'm not saying it isn't, but a lot of it is mostly coming from journalists who are writing about, this war not happening, which I'm not super versed with, so I'm going to let Matt touch on that in a minute. But I got to imagine that a lot of that has to kind of boil down to ratings, baby. Like, they don't have a lot to write about right now.
Sure.
And they want it to get going.
Right.
And it's not just like it's not getting going just because McClellan's, wanting to make everything perfect, which he definitely does. And that's, McClellan wants everything to be perfect. And there's later reasons, which we'll get into, why McClellan's reputation is the way it is, we think. But McClellan's also super sick. He comes down with typhoid.
Yep. December 23rd, 1861.
Hell of a Christmas gift.
Yeah.
Typhoid is obviously no cold like I'm getting over.
Right.
I mean, typhoid will kill you. It'll kill the ever-loving crap out of you.
Right.
So he's laid up. And the army hasn't been handed off to anybody specifically, so it's kind of like his staff is running the show. Right. So they're not without any directive. They're just business as usual. Get this army trained until we hear otherwise. So what's going on at this time with the journalists that are kind of starting to put this bigger pressure on? Sort of set the scene for that, Matt.
Well, I think the comment you had earlier, Kevin, was very poignant, because McClellan does have a honeymoon period. He is the dandy of the Republic, the young Napoleon, Little Mac, all of these accolades for several victories that he had had in Western Virginia. Not huge by any manner, but victories nonetheless in a period when the Union was very desperate for them. So he did come in on a wave of support from not only the politicians, but also the press. And McClellan is a professional soldier with a professional soldier's background, and so he wants to do those logistic factors that take time, and that's not fancy. And initially, he gets support from the press. Okay, our men at First Bull Run were untrained and unprepared. We need to have a professionally skilled, trained army. Excellent. And then a month goes by, and another month goes by. And this is time that the Army is digging in around Washington, the beginnings of the fort structure that we will eventually see around the Capitol is happening at this time. McClellan's using this time for not only building up his army, but training it. And none of that, as you implied, Pat, is fancy.
Right.
Okay? There's only so many times we can talk about this regiment came into the city and they look great and they're going to start their training, or they did such and such a drill or review and it looked fantastic. There's only so many times that the press can write about that. There's only so many times the politicians are going to want to hear about that.
Right.
Now, unfortunately for this mindset, Ball's Bluff happens.
Right.
Which is a freaking disaster.
Right. It shouldn't have been. They didn't need, what did they, bad intelligence. What did they think they saw? Tents, and it was like a sheep?
Exactly.
Or something.
Well,
No, not a sheep. It was a
Yeah,
fence. It was
yeah.
something stupid. Yeah, so I'm sorry to interrupt, but Ball's Bluff, I always come back to that thought. Like, the whole thing happens because people are dumb. Like, they just couldn't see.
Right. Well, they couldn't see. Inexperience was the key thing there. We had inexperienced soldiers on both sides. The Confederates are in an excellent defensive position and are able to jump on Federal troops when they come over the river. It's a disaster for the Union, not to the same scale as First Bull Run, but it once again cements this idea that these guys need time. They need experience. They need training. And the press doesn't want to hear that anymore. And the politicians don't want to hear that anymore, especially because one of their own just got popped.
Right,
with,
Baker.
With Baker, exactly. And of course, that's going to start a snowball effect in Washington with the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War being set up, which has political ramifications, as well as some, there's a lot of political issues with the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, but it is going to also pull out a lot of garbage officers.
Oh, yeah.
From the Army of the Potomac as well. Okay, so yes, it is going after folks that they don't like politically, but it's also going after officers who aren't doing their job.
Yeah, it's going to weed out those who aren't ready to do it. Kevin, can you kind of touch on the effect that Little Mac is having on his troops? Because in my understanding, this is around the time where his men really start to fall in love with his leadership. This is where they start to buy into the notion of that he's not going to waste their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. McClellan, I don't have the exact quote off the top of my head, but basically has an address to his troops saying that it's often quoted, but I'll paraphrase that he loves his troops and that he doesn't want to waste their lives, like you said. But also in that same address, something that often gets left out, he does talk about the necessity that this is a war and we're going to have to fight and people are going to have to die in it. But I think McClellan is able to take these soldiers that are farmers, blacksmiths, whatever, and instill in them this confidence that they are soldiers. And I think that, when you see green troops that often go into action on Civil War battlefields that hardly have any training, they do not typically perform well. But there are instances of green soldiers on the battlefield that they may not have been engaged in battle before, but they've been training for over a year, and under those circumstances, they perform pretty well.
Right.
And I think the Army of the Potomac will show that on the peninsula when they get there, is they aren't veterans of battles, but they have the sense of drill and training and discipline that has been instilled in them by McClellan and others is going to really mold that army into a reliable fighting force.
What a character trait of the American military complex. As you're saying that, I'm thinking about the American Expeditionary Force showing up in 1918. I'm thinking about landing on the beach at D-Day. We've had Americans in the World War II fight, but a lot of the guys that landed at D-Day hadn't been in a fight yet.
Mm-hmm.
And like this, it's that has become the staple, is like the green, well-drilled, well-prepared force, delivering in their moment. which I think is fascinating. And I think that ability McClellan has obviously is going to play into the up and down of his story arc as we go through this here, and stuff like that. So one last little thing I want to mention before we actually get this army out of the city is there's a quote I love, and I asked Matt to look into it to find out when it happens, but Lincoln's got a pretty good quote on this army not really moving at this time. Why don't you go ahead and set the scene and tell us a little bit about my favorite little Lincoln quote here.
Sure. McClellan's got typhoid. He's been out of the picture for a couple of weeks. President Lincoln's going to call a meeting at White House with a couple of officers. A guy we know, Irwin McDowell, and a guy we don't know as well, but we'll certainly learn more about during the Maryland campaign, William Franklin. He also has a couple of his cabinet ministers there as well. And so the president is going to say to McDowell and Franklin, if General McClellan is not going to use the army, I'd like to borrow it for a while.
Sick burn! Yo, Abe Lincoln with the jokes. I love that quote. Because you can kind of tell that this is a whole room, this is a whole city that's kind of like, let's go, let's go. And I love the human element of history. And one of my mantras that I throw out there is that, like, people are always people. We've always just been quirky and weird like we are today. And we do this thing in, I don't think we as history writers, but like the way that history gets documented in pop culture really dictates how we think about history. And like everybody's got these weird prim and proper mannerisms, and like this, everything has got this pseudo genteel touch to it, and everybody's sophisticated. And dude, people said the F word. There were guys sitting in, I guarantee you there was 2 Confederate soldiers sitting in the trenches of Petersburg going, this effing sucks. And like they're probably talking like that.
Yep.
They probably weren't going like, I declare that this is quite awful and terrible now, Jonathan. Like they weren't. I guarantee you nobody was talking like that. They were like, this is bullshit. Like, like I guarantee that's what was coming out of their mouths.
Oh, yeah.
And then like we forget that, that people are people. One last little example of that is there's a church in Alexandria. There's Christ Church. It was Robert E. Lee's church. When he lived in Northern Virginia, George Washington went there. Actually had his funeral at this church, or at least one of his significant memorials was there. I think his body was actually at that church, where a bunch of Washington's subordinates were there as pallbearers. But I digress. I get to a different. It's a different rabbit hole, guys. There's a Union soldier who's on guard duty for the cemetery, which the Union had cleared the headstones off of the cemetery, and they were using the graveyard as a logistical place. So there was lots of boxes, crates, food stores, things like that. It's war, guys. It doesn't sound great to say things like that, but we're just making use of the land around us. One of the first things the Union, the Federal Army of the United States does is they, quote, invade Northern Virginia by sending all their federal forces right over into Alexandria and Arlington just to occupy those cities. But here's a 21-year-old federal soldier from New York. I think he's from around Albany. I don't have my notes with me, but I think he's from around Albany, and he's bored. And he goes around doing something, and 150 or so years later, here's me taking a walk through the graveyard, looking at things, and I start to notice that a lot of these people live to be really old. Eleanor Wren, the wife of the architect of the church, lived to be 192. Some other people are 148. They got good water in Alexandria. Except I start to notice that the marking on the one is different carving than the rest of the digits, but it looks also old. So I got in touch with a bunch of the historical people that are attached to the church, things like that, and it finds out that some Union soldier, 21-year-old guy from around Albany, is going around scratching ones into the remaining headstones that had been cleared with his bayonet because he was bored. When I was 21, I did dumb stuff like that too. Every kid doodling on their desk is this Union soldier messing up these gravestones, right? So people are people. So I love that sort of scene with Lincoln and some of the officers and some cabinet members, because there's frustrated people in that room. And we're at a weird time, but eventually this army does get moving. And they will fast forward now to March of 1862. McClellan has landed with about 50,000 guys. And at this time, guys, it's important to note that we've skipped over a pretty important part of McClellan's resume at this time, because he's not just been named in command of the Army of the Potomac, he's also been named General-in-Chief of the United States Army, which is a big deal. And one of the reasons why this impatience has sort of gone the way it's gone is we've had Winfield Scott, who's 25,000 years old at this time, and weighs even more than that. No, in reality, Winfield Scott's been around in active duty since the War of 1812.
Right.
So he's an extreme old age for all things considered at the time. And with that age and stuff, like he's got a bunch of weight on him. He's essentially living and serving based on his reputation and resume. He's not actually fit for his command anymore. And luckily for everybody, there wasn't a war happening at the time, so it didn't really go any negative way it could have by having somebody in command who's not fit. But when a war did break out, it became pretty obvious we needed to have somebody else in this position, and that's where retirement came, and that's how McClellan gets this job. And it's sort of this dual distraction between being in charge of the whole Union war, because there is a war out in the West, Tennessee, and all of those, as west as that is. And we forget that. So he's also in charge of that, but he's also directly in charge of the war here in the East. So it's sort of this, I'm being torn between these things that McClellan kind of feels is maybe too much for him to handle. So he makes it real easy for him on March 11th of 1862, and he's going to relieve him of command of being the general-in-chief. So McClellan, you don't need to worry about the whole war. Just go win your war. Now that you've got your army down here on the Virginia Peninsula, just focus on that. And since, we believe in you and you got all this stuff and your men will fight and they're trained, like that's all you need to do. Now he's down at Fortress Monroe. Fortress Monroe is an interesting, got its own interesting story. We'll cover it another day, but tell us a little bit about what makes Fortress Monroe interesting for the Union Army, Matt, in the American Civil War.
Well, Fortress Monroe is been referred to as Freedom's Fortress. Okay, it's going to be one of the few forts, one of the few toeholds that the Union still has in the South at the beginning of the war. It is going to be a magnet for fleeing African Americans, enslaved individuals, almost from the beginning of the war. One of its earliest commanders is a guy who the South really hates, Benjamin Butler. Ben Butler in
Beast.
The Beast, yep.
Butler.
In August of 61, he is going to begin taking enslaved individuals into the confines of Fortress Monroe and not giving them back.
This is where contraband comes from.
This is where contraband comes from. Lincoln thinks that is a brilliant idea. Okay, he's a lawyer. Ben Butler's a lawyer. He can see the legal argument for it as a contraband of war. And so Butler's not going to give him back, and the government backs him. That's going to lead to the First Confiscation Act and eventually to the Second Confiscation Act as well. Now, Freedom's Fortress actually goes back even further than that. Of course, it's Old Point Comfort, just outside of Fortress Monroe, is where the first enslaved individuals were landed in 1619. There was just a big event that happened last year about that, the 400th anniversary of the beginning of African Americans coming to this country.
Before they were African Americans.
Right, exactly. Yeah. When they were still enslaved individuals began at that point. So long history there or I should say on the tip of the Virginia Peninsula. McClellan's going to land there on March 17th with his forces, and they're going to begin the Peninsula Campaign.
So I think there's some cool symmetry there. There's like a poetic symmetry, with the negative connotation, obviously, with the landing in 1619, and obviously the institution of slavery in the New World and everything that was and became in our country. But it's also brilliant to me in a way that the same exact stretch of beach is now symbolic of the freedom that was going to be fought for over the next few years in the war. I kind of like the poeticness of the way that works. Fortress Monroe's also got fingerprints from Robert E. Lee on it.
Oh, certainly
as an engineer.
Does.
So,
yeah.
Kevin, what made Fortress Monroe not attainable for the Confederacy to grab, like, all the other forts like Fort Sumter and Fort Pulaski and all these things in the South? Why is Fortress Monroe a Union fort in 1862?
Well, one, it's at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula between the York and James Rivers, and it's huge. It is a huge fortress, and I think it's the second largest fort in North America at that time, something that covers like 16 acres. And it had been a federal army installation in the decades leading up to the Civil War, and it was one of those forts that always had troops in it. In fact, some of the Army troops that were supposed to come and help squash John Brown's raid were stationed originally at Fortress Monroe.
Wow,
and
that's a
never made it to
distance.
Harper's Ferry in time.
I was going to say,
But,
that's
yeah.
a distance.
Yeah. But Fortress Monroe is just a huge, it was so big, and the Confederates really never had a chance to get at it.
I got to imagine the lack of a Confederate Navy also helped enforce that point, that they didn't really have a huge. The only way to really get to that fort effectively would be a naval assault, and they don't have the biggest navy in the world. But Norfolk Shipyard's right there, so they got to. First of all, I got to imagine that the fire at the Navy Yard there from Fortress Monroe must have been amazing to watch.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's about as close as I would want to be to that.
And Pat's referencing when the Union abandons Norfolk and sets fire to the Navy Yard at the beginning of the war.
Early in the war. But so Fortress Monroe is going to be the launching point for the Peninsula Campaign, which we're not going to cover the whole campaign. We're going to kind of breeze through it because it's a table setter like the Loudon Campaign we talked about earlier for Fredericksburg. You got to understand the Peninsula Campaign to understand the Maryland Campaign. It directly sets it up. So the Army is going to continue growing. McClellan lands with like a little over 50,000 guys, and this is going to keep growing. And when he finally gets moving, he's got around or in excess, depending on what your reference or first primary source you're looking at, he's got anywhere between like 85,000 and 105,000 guys, right? Somewhere in this window. And he's going to engage in a series of battles and a siege. And some of them are going to be on battlefields we've already fought over in this nation. Yorktown, Williamsburg, Drury's Bluff, places like that. What makes some of these battles significant, Matt, just for the things to come? Because, we're not fighting your every Civil War battle. We've got big artillery down here. We've got some stuff we're going to see in like a half a century later, some stuff like that going on.
Right. What's important for the Peninsula Campaign, or one of the many aspects that's important to remember about the Peninsula Campaign is that we have George McClellan operating in a very distinct manner. McClellan is very much of this idea of limited warfare. The war is about striking the enemy army. It's about striking the enemy capital. He is moving on Richmond. Okay? So when he is moving to places like Yorktown, and he's going to besiege Yorktown, he's hoping to either smash the defenders there or force them to pull out, which is what will eventually happen. They do pull out of Yorktown before the batteries can open fire. But we're going to have brilliant engineering going on. This is an engineer's war at this point. He's building his way towards Richmond. Because again, he's not looking to cut a swath through Virginia. He's not looking to bring the hard hand of war to Virginia. He is trying to defeat the Confederate Army and cut the heart out of that army, cut the heart out of the Confederacy by taking Richmond. This is a very set-piece type of warfare. Now, Kevin, you and I have talked about this a little bit before. The Confederates themselves, how are they handling this type of warfare?
Not well, to put it bluntly. There's so much focus typically with the Siege of Yorktown on McClellan's cautiousness, slowness, not willing to attack. Right. But little is paid attention to the Confederate reaction to this. And Joseph Johnson is writing back to Jeff Davis and Robert E. Lee saying, if they keep fighting us in a war like this, we can't win.
Right.
We can't out-engineer them. We can't outshoot them when it comes to artillery.
Right.
They have naval superiority. And so McClellan did a really fantastic job of using the advantages that his army held over the Confederates to pin the Confederate army on the map, so to speak, so that it
while
could not
husbanding his infantry.
Yes, correct. Yeah, so that the Confederates could not outmaneuver and use its smaller force, its quicker force, as Robert E. Lee will make a staple of the Army of Northern Virginia, to wrestle the initiative away from George McClellan, and so McClellan achieves essentially a bloodless victory there at Yorktown, but he does force the Confederates to pull back ultimately towards Richmond.
So we keep fighting and we keep moving up the peninsula here, and we're gonna kind of speed things along in the timeline. We end up in June of 1862, and we got a Union Army that has had a plan that has worked, and we are on the doorstep of ending this war. That's where the famous sayings that there are Union soldiers that could hear the church bells in Richmond, right? We're just sitting mere miles outside of the Confederate capital. This plan that took forever to get in motion, that everybody gave McClellan a whole bunch of crap for, is working. And it's working with relatively little damage to the countryside and to the Union War. I mean, they're taking casualties, but like you said, we're also winning these battles with, bloodless efforts and things like that. Just the sheer numbers in front of us, the tactics, the positions, they're causing the Confederacy to react without truly engaging. So what changes things? We go from having this war being almost over to we're about to see one of the greatest military turnarounds in all history, not just our nation's history. I mean, I'm struggling to think of a 90-day piece of fighting that takes an army and an army, a nation, whatever. It takes it from literally, like you said, pinned to the mat, from the 3 count, or if you're a boxer, from the 10 count, and puts you in a position to be delivering a potential knockout blow.
Right.
We get to this battle here. We get into the marshland, I guess, up where like Glendale, Malvern Hill, and Seven Pines are, and things start to change. Matt, take us through sort of what happens at those 3 battles, Seven Pines, and like the 48 hours after Seven Pines, because they're going to change everything, not just for the Confederacy, but for the war.
Right. And this is a little bit of a confusing part of the story for the Peninsula, because on May 31st, this is where the situation is going to begin to change with a Confederate offensive battle known as the Battle of Seven Pines. That'll be May 31st and June 1st of 1862. Now, Seven Pines, immediately after that, several weeks after that, we're going to have the 7 Days campaign. Okay? And so that is times often confused.
Yeah, I
so
just keep it straight.
Keep that in mind when you're doing your own reading and research on this. But the Battle of Seven Pines, we will have Confederate forces under Johnson go on the offensive. It is something of a disjointed series of attacks, but the Confederates are on the offensive. They're attacking. By the end of the first day, the day of May 31st, the Federal line has held.
Malvern Hill.
No. Again, you're thinking 7 days.
You're right.
Yep. The Federal line is held. Johnson is actually receiving unwanted for him guests because Davis has come up.
Right.
Lee is there. They're kind of poking around the army, trying to figure out what's going on, how the commanders are dealing, how the men are doing. And it would be while Johnson is trying to worry about his boss and his boss's boss, if you will, being right there at his shoulder, he is actually going to be hit.
Now, are we still, hold on, before we get into this, are we still looking at Lee like old Granny? Like Granny Lee? Is he still kind of got this,
yes,
you're an old feeble kind of aura about him?
Right. And that comes from actually his compatriots, okay, because he had ordered Confederate forces to dig in Western Virginia and things of that nature, and his background as as an engineer and with fortifications and whatnot, he was derided as being Spades Lee for digging in, or Granny Lee, things of that nature. So nobody's thinking of him as the dynamic Robert E. Lee of late 62 or 63 and beyond that we think of today.
It's quite a perception change that's about to come. So as you're saying, so we have an artillery shell, it goes off, and it's going to really wound Joe Johnson. I believe he's hit in the arm and in the chest with some fragments of
he's actually going to be shot in the chest.
Is he shot in the chest? I thought he's hit by and
he's hit by a shell
fragment. Okay, so I didn't know he was shot. Cool, you learn something new every day. Even the host's learning here. But he's out of the fight. So now the Confederate Army, which has not been led by the most famous face that we're all going to associate with it, is now out of a commander period, right? Lee hasn't been there as their commander, and the commander they have is now out of the fight.
Right.
What happens next?
On June 1st, they will be briefly under the command of a guy that nobody remembers, G.W. Smith.
Who's the name of the shortstop before Derek Jeter for the New York Yankees? It's the same guy that commanded the Army before General Robert E. Lee. Who the hell knows? His name's Tony Fernandez, just for the record. But no, yeah, so I think that's important, that we don't just go from Johnston to Lee.
Right.
There is one, maybe 2 stops between Lee. One stop. Is it just the Smith?
Yeah.
Just Smith? All right, so pick it up from here. So where are we at now?
He has a breakdown.
Smith has a breakdown.
Smith has a breakdown. At least that's how it's termed. He has a breakdown at the end of Seven Pines. He's not able to continue the command. Davis and Lee are not impressed by him, which might be part of the reason why he has a breakdown. And Davis says, "Army's yours," to Lee.
On site.
Yes.
So right then and there, Lee is with the Army and stays with the Army.
Right. Now, what's fascinating is that the Army of Northern Virginia, because it was known as the Army of Northern Virginia by this point, is a series of divisions. We don't have the wing structure that we'll see later on yet. We certainly don't have a corps structure, which is something the Union Army has only picked up earlier in 1862, very early in 62. And so we have this series of disparate divisional commands. And so Lee is going to come into this basically logistical mess and try to begin to figure things out, which is one of the reasons I think we could say that there's several weeks that will then go by before anything really happens. McClellan is oftentimes blamed in this period for, again, being slow and cautious and so forth. Well, he's just been attacked. His army's just been attacked. Yes, they've done a fairly good job holding the line, but what's going on here? Because we've had fallback, and now suddenly aggressive. So he's trying to get a feel for the situation, and he'd commented they were just outside of Richmond. He's bringing up his big guns. He is bringing up his siege train to begin what he hopes will be the end game around Richmond. That's what the Federals are doing. The Confederates, with their logistical mess that is occurring after Seven Pines, they're trying to get things figured out. They're trying to get pieces in position, and they're trying to figure out how to talk to each other. Robert E. Lee is still learning his commanders. There's orders to move people around, obviously, and it's going to take time. But by the end of June 25th, we're going to have what becomes known famously as the 7 days.
Before we touch on 7 days, how much of the Mexican War experience, meaning when you say he's getting to know his commanders, and both of you guys can answer this, is, Thomas Jackson, Mexican War veteran, Lee's Mexican War veteran,
Longstreet's Mexican
War veteran, and not even just Mexican War, just prior experiences. Jeb Stuart's at Harper's Ferry in 1859 with Robert E. Lee.
Right.
How much of that helps the transition into command, and how much of that hurts, or what? Like, how would you describe some of the prior experiences in like this transition?
I would think very little, in the sense that, the largest army that Winfield Scott ever commanded in Mexico was something around 12,000 men.
Yeah.
And of course Lee was on Scott's staff at that point, but had never exercised command over that large of a force. And even while you might think that some of these students at West Point are learning about how to command an army and things like that, it's really a lot about engineering.
Right.
And I think this is not to diminish the importance of West Point and what was learned there by some of these future Civil War generals while they were there. But Richard Ewell has this tremendous quote. I love it, about the only thing that he knew when it came to being an army commander or being a commander of any size military force at the start of the Civil War was how to command 50 dragoons. And that's it. He'd forgotten pretty much everything from West Point that he had learned, at that point. So it's really about both Army commanders, but especially Lee at this point, as Matt's talked about, trying to figure this out.
What do you think about on a personal level, guys? Like, they've got some personal interactions in the past.
That might make it easier for Lee to communicate, but we also have to remember Lee's style of communication tends to be, he is fairly genteel. Okay, he is respecting of his fellow officers and commanders. He's not necessarily going to James Longstreet or Thomas Jonathan Jackson and giving them a shake by their collar and say, "You're going to go do this." He's saying, the commander of the army would like you to do blank, or you are requested to take your command here, that sort of thing. So it may have helped with him on a personal communications level, but sometimes I gotta figure it helps if you don't necessarily know the guy and be like, "Hey, go do your job."
Sure. For sure.
Sort of thing.
I always like to explore the human side of things like that because, communication is obviously sometimes and most times the most important aspect to anything you're doing. So, with the previous experience, maybe potentially being able to communicate better, I've often wondered about the effect that has on this transition. So, but Lee's in charge now.
Right.
And the Army's going to change its tactics. Earlier, we talked about the Confederacy essentially has two goals at the beginning of this war. One, defend itself. Two, gain international recognition. Now, we didn't go down that rabbit hole, and we're not going to go down the international politics rabbit hole, but the goal has been defense, right? I like sports analogies a lot. I'm a huge sports guy, so I use them for reference. So I'll use that again here. Is like the Confederacy has essentially been, we're going to hold the line. We're going to play defense this entire time. But Lee's going to come up with a new plan. We're going on offense.
Yep.
Attack, attack, attack. And 90 days are going to go by, and this is going to be a very different war. This is a Army of Northern Virginia that's on its heels right now, now. And they are wondering if this is about to be wrap-up time. And we have a Union Army that's kind of like a shark with blood in the water. It's thirsty. It's hungry. It thinks it's here. And it's trying to seize its moment. And then this weirdness happens in the marsh swamp lands of Virginia. And now we're on offense. So how do we get from here to Lee's crossing the river into Maryland roughly 90 days from now, Matt?
Right. And how we get there is we've got the offensive known as the 7 days, but we also have the machinations and issues within the Army of the Potomac itself, because at the beginning of this, June 25th, we're going to have the Battle of Oak Grove. Okay? And 7 days, that's Lee on the offensive. Oak Grove, that's a federal attack. And what has happened is that federal forces are advancing. McClellan, I should say, believes that his flank is going to be protected by federal forces coming overland. McDowell's corps, about 38,000 troops, was supposed to be sent to McClellan around Richmond. It was going to be not a classic pincer, but basically catching these two massive waves of troops. McDowell's 38,000, McClellan's about 100,000-ish troops, and catching Richmond between them. That doesn't happen. McDowell's troops are withheld. McDowell's troops are withheld for the defense of Washington. Now McClellan's flank is in the air. His troops go forward. They are going to run into some Confederate resistance. Oak Grove is not a big fight, especially by later 62 and onward scales, but it is going to start the ball rolling. Now, it's not going to throw off the Confederate plans, but it is basically going to be the beginning of this series of engagements, because the very next day, Robert E. Lee's offensive begins.
Now, it's funny. I love that you brought up the McDowell's guys getting held. I love McClellan's going to hang on to that so hard.
Mm-hmm.
And he also mentioned for the defenses of Washington, the one thing that we failed to mention a little while ago was the Army of the Potomac in August of 61 through the end of that year. This army that is in town, that is training and drilling, one of their jobs is to be building the defenses of Washington City. So if you go down to Washington, D.C. today, you can hang out with a very good friend of the show, Ranger Steve Fan. He is the keeper of all things Civil War defenses of Washington right now.
That he is.
Hell of a legacy keeper, doing great work down there, guy. But we have all these forts springing up, and at the time at the beginning of the war, we're going to give you a short lesson on it real quick. There's only one fixed fortification in D.C. That is the huge stone and masonry fort that is Fort Washington. That's about 13 miles south. It's almost sitting directly across from George Washington's Mount Vernon.
Right.
Without that, there is no actual defenses in the city. So we go from having only this fort to 4.5 years later, it's the most heavily fortified city in the world, because largely in part of the effort of these soldiers. They weren't taking it up as their own initiative. They were being ordered to do these things. But the Iron Brigade, very famously, before they become the Iron Brigade, all the elements of that soup are in D.C. becoming their regiments and the brigade, and they are building Fort Marcy and a lot of the forts that are on the Virginia side of the defenses, things like that. So, these guys that are in this fight right now have already done a lot of great work. And I just wanted to kind of make a sidebar to mention that, there's more than just training that is part of your detail. They built these forts, and when McDowell's guys are called back to sort of garrison these forts and build some of the newer ones like that, this is going to piss McClellan off.
Oh, yeah.
And he's going to hang on to this, when things really don't go his way, as like the thing if I just had those extra guys, so I love whenever we bring up the McDowell aspect of this campaign, because in a people being people moment, it really pisses McClellan off, and he kind of hangs his hat on it.
Yeah,
and he's complaining,
and he is somewhat in the right to do so, because he was promised those troops and had built
McClellan.
and had built part of his campaign on that.
Yes.
So June 26th, Lee has got his guys more or less ready to go. We're going to have Beaver Dam Creek, also known as Mechanicsville. I'll be the first fight of the 7 days campaign. And this series of engagements is fascinating because you're going to have a fairly chaotic, disparate series of orders and attacks being done by all of these Confederate divisions. The Union Army, again, we're not going to really get into the details of who's moving where for these fights, but the Union Army is going to be parrying these different thrusts, oftentimes doing more damage to the Confederates than they themselves are receiving. 4 out of the 7 battles during the 7 days would be, numerically at least, Union wins for the amount of damage they do. But, Kevin, what are they doing after each of these fights?
They're falling back.
They're absolutely falling back.
And in the case of after Gaines Mill on June 27th, McClellan has abandoned, or is in the process of abandoning his supply base at White House Landing on the Pamunkey, and moving that to Harrison's Landing on the James River.
Right. So he's already preparing to pull back to Harrison's Landing, which will be a huge federal camp a few days later. So Kevin hit on Gaines Mill. We're going to have Garnet and Golding Farm on the 27th and 28th as well. So we've got 3 engagements between June 27th and the 28th. Savage Station on the 29th. Again, Federal Army doing damage but pulling back. Glendale, one of those classic what-if fights, because
this is where Jackson doesn't make it.
Exactly.
Right? Jackson, very un-Jackson-like, gets lost.
Sleeping under a tree.
That's right. Yep. We have a couple of different engagements within the 7 days where Jackson's forces are late, lost, or he's sleeping. Yep. Because they had fought so hard and marched so hard. At least that's generally the defense that's brought forward during the 62 Shenandoah campaign, and his men and he are exhausted. This will drive federal forces back to the defensive position at, you mentioned it earlier, Malvern Hill.
It's funny when you watch the Ken Burns thing that we all watched when we were getting into this history, love and passion that we have. They say the war was fought in 10,000 places. And that's all I was thinking about. You're just listing off these battles and things like that. And we were talking about major fights. And if you couple in with all these other tiny little, like here, right, we're the War Department that we're broadcasting from today. My War Department studios are anchored here in Frederick, Maryland, right? So here we get to claim the Battle of Monocacy Junction, which is an 1864 fight. And that's July 9th, 1864. But the day before that, July 8th, we have a cavalry fight out here in West Frederick. And that's notable for the battle and that whole storyline, but it's a tiny little cavalry scrap fight. Or where I'm from in Montgomery County, Maryland, we have cavalry scraps in Bealsville and Barnesville, and these things that just don't make the history books and that you don't know about. And those, you couple that with all these millions of major things you just said in, like, what are we talking about, like 15, 20, 30 days sometimes? Like, this war really was fought in 10,000 places, and there's a lot of action, and so the people, wants to give Jackson's guys a little bit of a break, and kind of everybody, like, dude, I can't do this stuff, and we do pretend, right? We all do living history. We do the Weekend Warrior. We pretend to do this so we can teach about it, and that I'm tired after a Saturday of standing and talking, marching and fighting. Like, no thanks. So I'll give a little bit of a pass to everybody who fought. You guys all get a pass. Like. So Jackson at Glendale is sleeping. Things are getting crazy in the Unions now. We're at Malvern Hill, where the Union Army is going to make a pretty good stand.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Federal artillery will be massed on Malvern Hill, and unfortunately for the Confederates, we are going to have Confederate forces who were supposed to operate together show up late to the field. A very annoyed A.P. Hill will decide to kick this fight off himself.
Oh, A.P. Hill's not sick right now?
No, he's not sick right now. But his boys are about to get shot up because Longstreet's division is late and Hill is annoyed, and so he decides to send his troops in, and he is going to get chewed
they come
up.
In piecemeal, yeah.
Yep. Unfortunately, these attacks are going to continue. It's actually one of the accusations against Lee early on that he allows these attacks to continue, and so there's a number of commanders who are not happy about that, but this will allow the Union supply train and much of the army to pull back safely to Harrison's Landing. Now, once Federal forces fall back to Harrison's Landing, what do they got? They've got the army concentrated there, they've got their supplies there, and on the James right behind him is the Union Navy. So Robert E. Lee now has his opponent boxed into this wonderful little heavily defended corner with the Navy's even bigger guns. Some of those, by the way, were shelling Confederate positions during the Battle of Malvern Hill, too. There's a few of them launching shells all the way out there. So we've got the Federal Navy backing up the Federal Army that is now in this great little defensive pocket. What's Lee going to do? Is he going to attack that? No. He's going to begin to shift north. Known as, we now refer to it as the Northern Virginia Campaign, but it's going to begin to pull his army into Northern Virginia, going after someone that Kevin's been doing a lot of research on as of late, John Pope.
Yeah, so Pope is brought east end of June, actually the very same day that the 7 days actions begin at Mechanicsville or Beaver Dam Creek. Pope's Army of Virginia is created. And it's basically the ragtag forces that had been used to defend the northern Shenandoah Valley. And, you know, they'd been so terrorized by Jackson early on that Lincoln, who at this time, there is no general-in-chief at this point, so Lincoln and Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, are running the war personally. They're fed up with this lack of a unified command in Northern Virginia and the northern Shenandoah Valley, and so they bring Pope out from the west to come east. Pope is a Republican, an abolitionist, and is in line with this harder war that's starting to take hold of the Union war effort, this idea of taking the war to the south, not just its armies, but its civilians and its cities as well. And Pope is going to be pushing south from the area of Culpeper into Northern Virginia, and ideally almost put the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee's army, in a pincer, essentially, that Lee will be trapped between Pope's Army of Virginia and McClellan's Army of the Potomac, still there on the peninsula. And Lee, as Matt mentioned, is going to start shifting his forces north, believing that he's neutralized McClellan, to try to neutralize now Pope before those two Union armies can come together and create a host that, in Lee's mind, is too strong to overcome.
What a massive army that would have been.
Yeah, yep.
Like, I don't care about any momentum Lee has at this point. That's just too many guys to assail. Real quick before we continue, you know, I want to go back to Malvern Hill just for a moment. Kevin, in a war that's got a bunch of famous feudal assaults, you know, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, why are we not talking about Malvern Hill? I mean, that's kind of a similar situation. We got a big open stretch of land that's pretty obvious to don't attack, you're going to get killed on it, and they do it.
Yeah, it's difficult why it's not talked about as much. I would think one reason, perhaps, and this is just flying by the seat of my pants answer, but perhaps that it's not Lee's most well-known feudal assault. And that would, of course, it would happen a year and 2 days to the date after Malvern Hill, July 3rd, 1863, at Pickett's Charge. And so I think that's one reason that it doesn't get enough attention, though it probably should. I think in many ways it's a lot more feudal than Pickett's Charge ever was.
Sure.
And D.H. Hill, one of Lee's division commanders himself, said it wasn't war, it was murder.
Yep.
Yeah. And he was absolutely right, especially for the men of his division.
Was it
what they went through?
DH or was it AP? And I think it was DH who said, "Give me rebel infantry and federal artillery, and I'll whip the world."
Who was it that
Yes,
said, "Give me
yeah.
one regiment and I'll take that hill"?
Oh, stop!
I'm just kidding.
Morgan Shepherd.
movie reference.
Morgan
It's sad that we know who that actor
movie
is.
reference.
Yeah.
R.I.P. Morgan Shepherd. So anyway, I think it was AP Hill that said that because
Yeah, it was one of the hills.
Yeah.
You know, in
I
the
think-
Confederate Army, it's named that Lee, named that hill, named that
Anderson.
Anderson. Yes,
Andersons.
that's the other one.
There's
Thank
a
you, yeah.
million Andersons
Yeah.
there. So you know, the Army's turning its attention now a little further north. We're going after Pope. We're going after the Army of Virginia. So we're going to engage in some smaller actions. Tell us about the biggest action that Lee is going to engage in with Pope on a very familiar piece of land.
Bull Run. Second Bull Run.
Boom! Here we are. We're back in Northern Virginia, and we're back on some of the same lands. We're right near Manassas Junction again. And things are pretty much going to go the same way they went for the Union Army the first time, except maybe a little worse. We have Stonewall Jackson, as he is now known, because he's, at the first battle here, he's earned that reputation. There's a small pocket of people that think that name comes from a slight being leveled on him, for standing there frozen in fear. We'll never know, because B gets shot pretty quickly, and we'll never get to ask him what he meant by that, but nonetheless, Stonewall is here. We have one of the first, what I like to call, big heavyweight fights of the war in terms of unit-on-unit action. We have the Stonewall Brigade going up against what's about to become the Iron Brigade. When you dive into that fight over at the Bronner Farm, it's exactly what I just said. It is a heavyweight slugfest. Earlier we did the pin to the mat, the 3 count, the 10 count for boxers. The analogy I love using for this action at the Bronner Farm, because I grew up with, I might get some crap for saying this, but I think the heyday of heavyweight boxing in the late 80s, early 90s. I mean, the 70s had some great guys and things like that, but I mean, the era that had Mike Tyson and Riddick Bowe, Evander Holyfield, Lennox Lewis, all these guys. I mean, that to me, that's what I grew up with, and that's the best era of boxing. But I grew up with watching a bunch of the Riddick Bowe, Evander Holyfield fights. And in one of these fights, I think it was Bowe Holyfield 2, I don't think anybody blocked or played or did any defense whatsoever. It was just two huge dudes throwing haymaker right hands at each other and just bashing each other, and they went the whole fight. There wasn't a knockout or anything like that. I couldn't imagine taking a beating like that, and to me, that is what is happening here on the Bronner Farm at the end of August 1862, because we have units that are very tested on the Confederate side. Jackson's guys are the Stonewall Brigade. They've been earning every bit of their name and reputation, and we have these Iron Brigade guys who are tired of being around these New Englanders and these New Yorkers and all these other Pennsylvanians that are kind of giving them, like teammate ribbings and craps for being these weird Midwesterners and things like that. And this is their moment to earn it on a battlefield, and they do it. And they absolutely do it. And the way it happens is spectacular to me. One of the reasons the war as a whole is so bloody and devastating is because we're using slightly antiquated tactics with a lot of more advanced weaponry than we'd ever seen on a battlefield before. So in the past, when we're fighting wars with weapons that only have ranges of 80 to 100 yards of accuracy, we got to get real close just to even do this thing. I'm talking the Revolution all the way up through the Mexican War, the era of smoothbore weaponry, and now here we are with rifled weapons. Like everybody in the rank and file, not just your sharpshooters, almost everybody on the line has a rifled weapon, and we have guns with, manufacturers' ranges out at 800 to 1,000 yards, and your sharpshooters can do the damage realistically at 400 to 600 to 800 yards, and then we have your average line infantry now is pretty deadly between 200 and 400 yards depending on what we're doing. And here at the Bronner Farm, we're 80 yards apart. It's 1862 with all that history and all that smoothbore and these new advanced weapons, and we're still right up on each other, toe to toe, throwing right hands, and nobody's blocking. And they do this for 2 hours, and the only reason it stops is it gets dark.
Yep.
And,
Sun goes down.
Yeah, and I love that the imagery of what that scene must have been like. I mean, it starts off catching the Union off guard, and it's like you go from being like, oh crap, to like, all right, I'm in, bro, and like it's just you shouldn't have scared me. Now it's over for you, and unfortunately, for the Union Army, it isn't over for the Confederacy. The Iron Brigade does really well on the field for the Army. That's there, but the rest of the things don't go so well. And Pope's army more or less gets destroyed. Well, not destroyed, but beaten and demoralized in such a way that they're screaming straight back into. But
they're not routed, and that's a big thing to clarify. This is not First Bull Run. This is not 1861.
Yeah, that's why I corrected. They're not annihilated. Right. They are beaten and demoralized though, and that's huge.
Absolutely.
And they head back into Washington City. So what we've just witnessed here, guys, is an army that in the Confederacy that was on the brink of defeat. They had their enemy force sitting miles outside of their capital. Everything that could go well for the Union Army is going well for them. So Lee and Johnston at the time and Jeff Davis, they're all sitting here basically going, oh crap, this fight is almost over as quickly as it began. And now we're roughly 90 days from this moment where We get Johnston out because of wounding. Lee takes command, and now we're sitting in this position where Lee is taking command and beaten one army that was sent down to the peninsula to end the war, and now he's just beaten the other army sent to bail that army out. So things are looking really good for Lee. The momentum is heavy in favor of the Confederacy on a military level at this point. Now, we're not going to get into the super politics of the war right now, just because of rabbit hole reasons, guys. Like I said, we're minutia. That we're trying to keep this in like 2 to 3 hours time, and we're already way into this, so that could keep us here for weeks. But on a military level and on a PR level, like the public in the South is like pumped up. This war is going to go their way. They're going to get their nation yet. And in the North, where there was already kind of lukewarm support, now they're kind of like, why are we doing this? Like, let them go. And there's not a lot going on. And this is going to sort of set the stage for what brings us to why we even have Kevin here today, is because Lee is going to change the game, not just for the current campaign, not just for the current season of the war, but for the war as a whole and for the nation as a whole. And he's going to do so by writing Jeff Davis on September 3rd, asking for permission to cross the river. Except, much akin to my own personal spirit and things, this writing, asking of permission, he's not sitting and waiting for this permission. The moment he puts this letter in the mail, the army's crossing the river. And essentially this is I'm going to ask for forgiveness kind of thing. Permission, in quotes. Can I take my army north? Luckily for Lee, Jeff Davis is like, yeah, good idea, cross the river. And the reason that Lee wants to cross this river is twofold. And we covered a lot, so I'll just cover it very briefly. One, the obvious one that people go to first is, well, the army's hungry. There's food up there in Maryland. And that's a great point, because the army, the fighting in Virginia has destroyed all the agriculture in the area, and it's harvest season, and there's not a lot of picking happening outside of the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. So Lee wants to kind of take this pressure off of the citizens, because McClellan's intention wasn't to do this, but war just destroys things. Right. So an army moving through the area, armies fighting on your lands, in cornfields, things like that, it's really beating up the area. So we want to relieve this pressure by taking the fight somewhere it hasn't been yet. And he also wants to liberate Maryland, because there's this opinion and this view that Maryland is being held in the Union by force. Now,
which it wasn't.
Right. Yeah. This is something I was going to say that Matt and I love to shred to bits, which we will do in a complete other, maybe like small side episode when we just want to unload on this subject. But the short version is, guys, Maryland just decides it doesn't constitutionally have the right to even discuss secession. So this isn't a state being held in the Union by force. But in the minds of a lot of Southerners, it is. And Lee is one of these guys. And so a lot of his intention is to take this army into Maryland and be seen as liberators. And his army, which has just been chewed up in the process of all these victories, he's hoping to replenish his ranks with these newly liberated Maryland Southerners and things like that. So here we go. The army's crossing the river into Maryland. It's 1862. We're invading the North for the first time. The status quo of this war changes with that pen strokes, with those pen strokes. Once we go from defense to offense, things are different, Matt. So take us across the river now. Lee is in Maryland.
Yep, Lee is in Maryland. He's going to cross on September 4th, 1862, moving up into central Maryland, heading for Frederick, which he will begin to reach on 2 days later on the 6th.
So if we are sitting in this exact spot 158 years ago now, because we're in 2020. The future.
Crazy to think, yeah.
Barbara Walters. This is 2020. If we're sitting in this exact spot and we are who we are now, we're in our 30s and our 20s and stuff like that. What are we doing with this knowledge, knowing that this army is approaching, and likely with that army is somewhere probably another army, because this is a war. So what's happening in Frederick right now?
Well, in Frederick, we have a populace that is mostly Unionist. There is a small, but rather vocal, portion of the population of Frederick that is pro-Southern. The Markells are a very good example of that. They leave an excellent diary behind that talks about their leanings. But the bulk of the city is pro-Union, and so it's closing up shop. We have a lot of federal supplies in the city that are being shipped out of it. We have shops closing down. We have people trying to take their merchandise and things out of the city as best they can.
We have horses, right? One of my examples, I think we have a lot of horses disappearing into the hills and the countryside, so that the army don't take their stock, their livestock.
Right. We have federal troops in the area that are guarding the railroads and the bridges and things pulling out because they can't stand in front of Lee's troops, which are in the neighborhood of probably about 50 to 55,000 men when they cross into Maryland. So Frederick, Maryland, fairly large crossroads city at that time, railroad connection and everything else, is basically closing down shop. And Lee is going to comment about the cool reception he receives here in Maryland. He was expecting to have a much more enthusiastic welcome. He does not get it. Perhaps if they had shown up in southern Maryland or elements of eastern Maryland, he might have gotten that. But out here, it's mostly small farmers, it's small industry, things of that nature. And there's a whole branch, and this is something we oftentimes don't talk about too much, is there's a whole section of the folks out here that just want to be left alone, too.
Yeah.
That aren't really interested in the politics of the time or the war. They just want to be left alone. And we see that a lot out towards Sharpsburg, which we'll eventually head towards.
So you notice a theme, I'll direct this to you, Kevin, is we've talked about a lot of battles that take place near a lot of crossroads and junctions. Manassas Junction gets 2 battles. We're talking about, the army's moving here towards Frederick, which is a junction town, and we're going to fight, later in the summer of '63 at another crossroads junction town in Pennsylvania and things like that. Why is that?
Simple. You gotta to move wagons and artillery and everything to supply your army. You need roads.
Right. We don't have airplanes yet.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah. Exactly right. Roads dictate where everything goes,
Right.
And especially if it's better roads. Like Frederick had some very well-known turnpikes. Really,
Yep.
the first interstate highway, you could say, with the national road
Right.
running through it, and so that's what brings the armies here. Of course, for the Confederates too, it's more the roads, but the railroad also.
Right.
Running through here is for the Confederacy. It's a chance to take out some infrastructure
Right.
north of the Potomac River as well.
And they
Right.
do destroy the Iron Railroad Bridge across the Monocacy River in
Right.
'62. They're going to attempt to cut up the C&O Canal. They'll not be as successful doing that, but they're going to attempt to cut that up as well.
Yeah, once upon a time, friend of all of ours, Jake Wynn from down at Claire Barton Missing Soldiers and Civil War Med up here in Frederick, he and I did a little educational trespassing to try to find some of these, because there's rumors that there's still some of the evidence of Lee's destruction along the B&O line, but unfortunately for all of us historians, CSX owns all of those grounds. So long before our brands and careers started and anybody knew who Jake and I were, we decided to, skirt the rules a little bit to go try to find some history. And unfortunately, we didn't find anything that was cool. We have a pretty cool story out of it. But one of the things that we did note was that it must have been a hell of a thing to try to destroy a lot of the infrastructure in this. There was a ton of it. It's not like this was a single track here. Like this was a big railroad area. Monocacy Junction, which is its own separate township technically from Frederick during the war. It's just like a little village just south of Frederick. Now it's overall part of Greater Frederick. I mean, it's in Frederick in 2020. You're not in a separate town there, and the junction's gone in terms of the village. The train junctions are all there.
Yep, still the same junction.
Yeah, you go down there and you can see like there's tracks coming in from a couple different directions. So it's a pretty busy area. And yeah, like I said, there's no planes, guys. So we're not going to get deep into the woods because there's no airdrop coming. So we got to be near where everything moves. I also think it's important to note that the junction, especially the railroad, like you keyed on, is important with sort of, especially like Lee's intentions here, which I'll drop it back to you, Matt. Like Lee's purpose for being in Frederick is what?
He wants a fight on northern soil because that dictates everything else.
Where does he want this fight?
He wants the fight either in Maryland or Pennsylvania. It doesn't necessarily matter where it's at as long as he can find an area where he can set up and destroy a pursuing federal force. But he wants this fight on Union soil because he is hoping to keep up the pressure, which you mentioned. Okay, he's been on the offensive since the 7 days. He wants to keep up that pressure. Yes, there is the supply issue from Maryland and maybe Pennsylvania that he wants to take advantage of. He's hoping to affect the fall elections of 1862 by defeating a Union army on its own turf. That might cause more peace Democrats to be elected to Congress. And of course, there's the big issue of European recognition for the Confederacy.
Right.
And that is sometimes blown over, but folks, England and France, and particularly England, was absolutely looking at the Confederacy at this time for possible recognition. And had that happened, that would have possibly changed the game. Had England been able to recognize the South as an independent country, they would have been able to intercede militarily, not just supplying ships and guns and things on the side, tee-hee, we're going to sell you this stuff quietly, but the Royal Navy showing up off the American coast and pushing away the blockading forces, reopening southern ports to international commerce. That could potentially have changed the game of this war.
Question for you, Kevin. Would a single victory, or would Lee have had to have campaigned successfully in the North?
Personally, I think a single victory would have been enough to do it. Campaign is obviously ideal. That's what Lee wanted to do. The Maryland campaign is only 18 days long. Lee did not intend to be here north of the Potomac River for 18 days. He wanted to be here well into October, maybe even into November, to try to influence the northern elections. But I think ultimately what he was looking for was a single battle, believing that if he could, it's 3 strikes and you're out basically for the Union Army in Virginia in 1862. He's got 2 strikes. If he can get number 3 on there, I think it's the opinion of a lot of the high command of the Confederacy that one more battlefield victory, especially north of the Potomac River, is enough to get Britain and France to jump.
Yeah, and then like you were saying with the Peace Democrats, like the citizen population of the North has been lukewarm about this, and they're in phases. They've been really hot about preserving the Union, and then they've also been kind of like, because they're all detached from it. This isn't the social media world we live in now, right? Where not everybody's super plugged in. Right. And one of the things we're going to touch on when we get to the Antietam part here in a minute is, like this is a moment where we do kind of get plugged in to the war that's going on. But I think Lee's one of his big goals, right, is to just make sure that the citizen population of the North doesn't support this, because once they see the ravages happen on their land, they're going to be like, F this.
Right.
Don't bring this crap to my doorstep. Lincoln, get out of this fight. They fought in my yard. Like, you're going to see a lot of that in the voting. So we're here in Frederick, right? We've got the Army of Northern Virginia. Roughly how many guys do we have here?
Roughly 50,000 troops.
All right. So we're looking at possibly striking out into some places here. We got a railroad that can, depending on a certain junction here or there, can get you to Harrisburg, can get you to Philadelphia, can get you to Baltimore. These are 3 pretty major Union cities. So, one of the things I like to think of is, what if Lee doesn't want to just campaign and draw a Union army out into the open and fight it there? What if he goes after a city? He doesn't have to go in Washington City, which is defended, and why would you do that? Now, to be very clear, almost every major Union city, and especially port city, has a defensive system going on in it. One of the things that as a researcher I'm trying to start dipping my toes into right now, with the help of our buddy Rich Condon, is just exploring the Civil War defenses of Pittsburgh. There's a big waterway going on up there. They have some major fortifications going on interior. If you think that Pittsburgh's nowhere close to the coastline, but it's got a defensive system there just in case something happens. So, I don't imagine that Lee would be striking out towards an undefended Baltimore or Philly or Harrisburg. In fact, Harrisburg does have some really good defensive systems there on the Susquehanna. Yes, and I think today some of them are still around. I don't know if they're open for visiting, but I think the remnants physically are there of some of them. But, I always wondered, what if Lee took his army and went after a population, like a city? He didn't go after the people themselves, but could you imagine if Lee marched his army into Harrisburg or Philadelphia?
Well, that's what the War Department's afraid of.
Right.
Henry Halleck, who is by this point the general-in-chief, is freaking out that the Army of Northern Virginia is going to be heading for either Washington or Baltimore. And those 2 cities are going to play a very key role in what becomes the Union strategy for the Maryland campaign, because it's one of McClellan's 3 objectives. And I don't want to jump too far ahead, but he is under orders to make sure that does not happen, that those cities remain protected.
So obviously we've got this Confederate Army, right? It's here in the North now, because say what you want about the Mason-Dixon line, guys. It's not the demarcation line between North and South. It was literally a boundary dispute way back in the days before we talked about things in Northern and Southern terms. My basic understanding is it's attached to William Penn in some way. It's basically back in our establishment of the boundary between Maryland and Pennsylvania.
Correct.
And it isn't even the official boundary line between Maryland and Pennsylvania. My best understanding is that the Mason-Dixon line exists almost exclusively in Maryland, like its entire way, all the way out even into Delaware. Which, hey guys, the Mason-Dixon line is also part of Delaware's history too. It's not just north-south of Maryland, Pennsylvania. But we've got this Confederate army in the north of the Potomac River, and Lee is gonna realize that he's made. I don't know if it's a critical error. In fact, I'm gonna say it is a critical error. He's realized that he's left about 10,000 Union soldiers in his rear, and this is important.
Right.
Because it's going to dictate the plan now. Because the plan initially is to get into Maryland and move in one direction. And now he's got to kind of look backwards for a minute.
Right.
So tell us.
Well, I was going to say, Kevin, you want to touch on this? Because it's not necessarily Lee's error. It's the situation that he has now found himself in.
Right, yeah. When Lee crosses the Potomac River outside of Leesburg, he crosses between Washington, D.C., where both the Army of Virginia and the Army of the Potomac, recently arrived in some cases from the peninsula, are coalescing and gathering. And of course, Harper's Ferry is on the other side of Frederick, so Lee is literally slicing between those two forces. And it's constantly a power struggle between McClellan and Henry Halleck about what to do with Harper's Ferry and the garrison there. McClellan wants to either relieve it and have it join his army, or just have them leave Harper's Ferry altogether and abandon it. Henry Halleck is of the opposite mindset. He does not want to abandon Harper's Ferry, and in fact, one of the last orders given to its garrison commander, Dixon Miles, is to hold Harper's Ferry to the last extremity. And that's ultimately what's going to happen. It's a little unclear. Halleck never gives a specific reason why he wanted to hold Harper's Ferry.
Well, that was going to be the next question.
Yeah, to the last extremity. I think it's because of the supplies that are there and also protecting the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. But Halleck never lays that out specifically. But nonetheless, it is almost, I wouldn't say an error on Halleck's part, but it is just something that happens that leads to, in many cases, you could say the undoing of Robert E. Lee's campaign.
Right.
It's just a domino effect.
So leads to that. He's got like 10 to 14,000, depending on your numbers, right? Troops, because we've also had the smaller garrison at Martinsburg. Mm-hmm. As soon as they find out Lee's even about to cross this river, they're like, deuces, and they fall back to the bigger numbers at Harper's Ferry. So we've got this concentration, this pretty sizable force in a city that, I mean, anybody that's been there, can really understand the Jackson quote of "I'd rather attack the city once than defend it 100 times" or whatever he says. Like it's surrounded. It's a terribly indefensible city. Beautiful, like really scenic, but from a military aspect, I would never want to be charged with holding this town. And if I did, I would use my brain, unlike some people we're going to talk about in a few minutes here. But we've got Lee. And he's got to do something now at this point, because he can't really move in any direction, leaving this force at his back door. Because my best understanding, guys, is if anything goes wrong, Lee needs to be able to get back across the Potomac quickly. And I don't care how big your army is, 12,000 guys is going to stop you for at least 30 minutes, right? And minutes are critical sometimes in this campaign.
Certainly.
So Lee's got to do something about it. What does he do about it?
Well, he's got the issue of Harper's Ferry, and he has a now beginning to stir Army of the Potomac. And on September 8th, we're going to have the initial clashes of this campaign, down near Hyattstown.
Cool. Actually, before we get into that, I'm making a grave error for our own podcast here. So in the wake of this boxing in down on the peninsula, you can clarify it here in a moment, either of you guys, but at a certain point, McClellan's going to be removed from command of the Army of the Potomac. He is not going to be in charge of running the show, and that's going to be important because he's going to show back up, and that's a huge thing for the Union Army here. So sort of go back into our story for a minute here. Both you guys tell me a little bit about that. I want to start actually with Kevin here.
Okay, I'll say yes and no. He's not by orders removed from command.
Right.
He is instead basically removed from command. I think the idea was, Henry Halleck is really, he's his right hand is not talking to his left hand when he's dealing with McClellan and Pope. He tells Pope that, when the two armies are together, you're going to have command. And he tells McClellan the same thing. When the two armies are together, you're going to have command. But really, I think the one of the ulterior motives of John Pope bringing him east is it would look very dangerous for the Lincoln administration to fire McClellan altogether because of his war Democrat leanings, and Lincoln is trying to cater to the war Democrats to support him in the upcoming elections, and so he doesn't want to just get rid of him like that. And so Lincoln kind of wants to shove McClellan under the rug and have everybody forget about him. And Lincoln's plan for that is basically siphoning troops away from McClellan and giving them to Pope. And then Lincoln can all of a sudden say, well, okay, sorry, George, you don't have anything in command. Why don't you go home, basically? And McClellan himself writes to his wife, I think it's in late August during the second Battle of Bull Run, and McClellan will tell his wife that basically all he's in command of is his headquarters guard at that point. And so, he's almost without official orders. He is kind of removed, but not officially. He's almost just forgotten about, essentially. But of course, he becomes almost this phoenix rising up out of the ashes. If you will,
and that's why I wanted to address that. And that's kind of why I worded
Yeah.
it that way, because if you watch the James Earl Jones sort of visitor center video that has been at Antietam forever, one of the things they kind of make it seem like is like, that whole thing that when McClellan is put back in charge of running the show, they make it seem like he hadn't been anywhere in the Army. It's like, McClellan's back. And I think there's this stigma that exists that, we think McClellan is outright not with the Army after this debacle on the Peninsula. And that's not true. And that's why I wanted to get into that for a minute, is because, like, when we talked about his up and down, story arc, he's this hotshot who rises. He's given this command of this brand new army, and then his star keeps rising because this war is real. So we got to retire our legend in Winfield Scott. And so now he's got these two jobs, and maybe it's too much. So he's kind of relieved of one to focus on the other. And then that one doesn't go well. And like you said, he's kind of pushed under the rug, and that is also not really sitting well with people. And suddenly this Confederate army shows up in Maryland, and now it's like, I'm going to speak like the younger kids today, it's hella real for the Lincoln administration. They're like, oh, damn, this isn't just a little rebellion in the South now. This is an invasion of us, and it's weird to think about that them versus us thing, but that's kind of where their mentality is at, is that you're not trying to validate them as a foreign entity, but they're kind of thinking this like foreign army just rolled up into our domain, our turf, and they got to do something about it. And before we sort of get into the story a little bit more here, the road structure we were talking about is a big part of how the pursuit of Lee takes place. In the second Bull Run campaign, the fight at the Bronner Farm is kicked off by troops going up the Warrenton Turnpike. It's modern day Route 29. They're using the roads, and there's other elements of the Union Army running on parallel roads. We have in the Antietam campaign right now, Maryland campaign, they're going to be starting when they come out of the city, like on fingers of a glove. They're going to kind of be just using all the main arteries to, spread out and find whatever they can, which you imagine when you watch the news and you see all these horrible things where they're looking for things and people sometimes that are missing in fields, and they do the arm-to-arm linked searches. These armies moving on these parallel roads is essentially a large-scale version of that. We don't know where anything is, so we'll just hit whatever we can. And when something goes wrong, everybody falls into that area. So, so Lee he's aware that he's got to do something about this garrison out in Harper's Ferry. The armies of Virginia and Potomac are starting to stir, and McClellan is going to be given back his spot running the show.
Correct.
When does that happen?
That's a good question, because we generally plink about September 2nd is generally the date that is put down as McClellan is put back in charge of all Union forces in and around Washington, D.C. That is the Army of Virginia, Pope's troops that have fallen back on the national capital. That is the Army of the Potomac that is now basically completed, coming back from the Peninsula, and the Washington garrison. McClellan is ordered to merge these three disparate commands into one fighting force, the newly reconstituted, if you will, Army of the Potomac. And this is the army that he will then take out of Washington, D.C. He'll move his headquarters on the 7th?
Night of the 7th.
Night of the 7th, he moves his headquarters out of D.C. The army is on the move, and it is the next day, September 8th, that his vanguard, his cavalry, is going to begin to bump into Jeb Stuart's cavalry strength.
So when this happens, Matt, this is going to cause Lee to realize that he's got to do something. The Army's about to be on him, or not about to be on him, but rather they're aware of his presence, and the beginning of the pursuit is happening, and Lee now knows there's a clock. He's on it, and he's got to do something. So what does he do once he's had this cavalry clash and Jeb Stuart has engaged with some of Little Mac's guys?
Right. Between the Federals that are now behind him at Harper's Ferry and the Federals that are now advancing on him out of Washington, Lee is going to write an order. The order that will dictate the movements for much of the rest of this campaign. Many of you out there are probably very well aware of this order, Special Orders 191, the infamous Lost Orders of the Maryland Campaign. And the Lost Orders' impact on the campaign has been somewhat overblown in the last few years, last few decades, if you will. But it does set the movements for much of the campaign. Now, the Army of the Potomac is already pursuing Lee. This document will break up Lee's army. It is a marching order. It's not a battle plan. Let me emphasize that. It is not a battle plan. It's been misidentified as a battle plan by many very good historians in some cases, stating that it was a battle plan for Antietam. They don't even talk about Sharpsburg or Antietam in 191. This is specifically for
the neutralization of Harper's Ferry.
The neutralization of Harper's Ferry and moving Lee's army towards Hagerstown.
Right.
So 191 is written on the 9th. It is issued on the 10th. Confederate forces begin moving that day. Jackson's command is going to be in the lead. He is commanding a wing, about half of the Confederate army. He's actually going to have more of the Confederate army added to his command so that he can go down to Harper's Ferry and neutralize that garrison. He is to drive it out or capture it. And in fact, capture it is the preferred.
Right.
The rest of the Confederate army, James Longstreet's portion of the army, along with Lee, will continue westward over the Catoctin Mountains, down into the Middletown Valley, beyond South Mountain, heading for Hagerstown.
Yeah, they're going to kind of camp in that gray area land between Boonesboro and Hagerstown, right? They're going to kind of hold up in that spot.
Right. Because Hagerstown is the natural, again, it's the crossroads.
It's another train junction city.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. It's another junction for the Army to meet up if they want to continue. They can basically move any direction they want to from that spot. So that is kind of the focus for the Army. Of course, Jeb Stuart's involved. He's going to be guarding the wagon train. He'll also have elements out front playing the vanguard. And Jackson's going to have a number of divisions taking all the high ground, the Maryland Heights, the Loudon Heights, the Schoolhouse Ridge around Harper's Ferry.
Yeah, this is Jackson's finest moment on a battlefield in the American Civil War. I mean, this is like his...
You're going to have some Chancellorsville guys debate you on that.
Yeah, but you know what? This is a masterpiece right here.
It is.
Like, this is an outright masterpiece. Like, there are moments of Chancellorsville that don't go their way, i.e. Jackson gets shot, amongst other things. But at Harper's Ferry, there is no Jackson getting shot, and there is no real negative aspect to the Confederate action here. They circle the city, they win on the ground in the Murphy Farm fight with A.P. Hill, and by the time the artillery opens up, it's already a done deal. And in fact, Dixon Miles has been told by his guys at his Council of War, like, give this up. And it's those orders to the last extremity, and maybe some ego with Miles, that are going to cause this to be a pretty bad day for the Union Army. Pretty bad couple days, because it does take Jackson longer than it is intended to get there. Because one thing I like to point out is when Jackson goes up and around, he comes down through Martinsburg and things like that. He spends a little bit of extra time in Martinsburg because he's getting some love. He's getting some adoration up there. They're pumped to see Jackson's guys. And these guys had been campaigning and receiving not a lot of love. And most of the love getting sent to them was being sent to them in the form of 57 and 58 caliber leads, courtesy of the Union Army. So when they roll into a town and they're waving flags and they're blowing kisses and they're getting flowers and food and it just feels good. And he wants to spend a few minutes in it, which, you know, on a human level, I get. When you've been around crap for so long and something feels good, you want to hang out in it. But it does make Jackson uncharacteristically late, just like he was, you know, a few times on the peninsula. Like, we have this notion and image in our heads of Jackson is like military, strict and on time, and everything is to the minute and perfect, and this is how we do it and regimented, and here he's late. But it doesn't really affect the Harper's Ferry action because he does, capture the city with relatively little blood spent. There are some fights up on Maryland Heights, and there's actually some pretty good cavalry action. In fact, that's how we end up finding out initially what's going on at Harper's Ferry. Is we have Colonel Ford, I think, and his cavalry break out at some point. But before we get to that actual action, right? So we've had this Confederate army split up, and they're starting to move into positions. And McClellan's army has left Washington City. Pope has been sent west, and obviously, Pope has got a funny little story when he goes west. He's had this debacle at Second Manassas, Second Bull Run. He's kind of persona non grata in the city of Washington. We got to get you out of here. Good thing for you that you're a pretty good commander. And there's another war going on that we never really talk about. Is that there's this Great Sioux War happening out, in the plains, the Midwest and stuff like that. And sidebar, without even going into it, in an overall picture, we forget that the entire North American continent is almost militarily engaged right now because the French and the Mexicans are fighting at the exact same time below the border in the Second French Intervention. So we have an American Civil War at the same time of a Great Sioux Uprising, at the same time that there's a Mexican and French War going on. And it is a weird place to be in 1862. And Pope gets sent out to, Chicago, I believe?
Chicago.
First, yeah. And there he's received with a lot of love, and they're happy to see him. And he goes out on this balcony and he makes this great speech about defeating the Sioux and all this stuff. And good night, and everybody's happy and woohoo. And then the next day, the news about Second Bull Run shows up, and they almost run him out of town. And I, go kill the Sioux, get out of here. Like, we just don't want you around. And I love that. But McClellan, now back to the story. McClellan's got his army. The Army of the Potomac is moving. The morale has lifted a lot in this army because McClellan is loved by his men. And when he is effectively removed, not officially removed, this is another demoralization on top of the military one they just took. These guys just got their asses kicked, and they don't feel good about that. And then the guy they love, they just got taken away from them in a sorts. Mm-hmm. They don't like that either. But now he's back, and they're pumped, and they're ready to go fight for Little Mac. So we're moving north in a couple days. I think we're talking less than 48 hours after the Confederate Army vacates the area that becomes Monocacy National Battlefield in the future, because the Battle of Monocacy Junction happens there about 2 years later. We have the Union Army move up through the same piece of land. There's a corporal from the 27th Indiana, Barton Mitchell, who's going to find this weird-looking package with some cigars, doesn't care about the paper on it. I just found some sweet cigars, man. Mm-hmm. Another soldier is going to realize the significance of the wrapper. It's this extra set of orders that's issued. I believe it's D.H. Hill's copy of 191, which you can imagine were packaged with a, my compliments kind of thing. Like, here's some stogies and your orders. Have a good night, General. And for whatever reason, they don't make it to him. And people are critical of DHL for this. And he's like, I never got my copy. So
he has the copy that he received from Jackson.
From Jackson, right? So he doesn't get Lee's official copy. So, so for Hill, he doesn't really find out about it until it's off to the fact. But what we have here is a Union Army that's effectively holding, and I think here's where that misconception comes from, because we often say that here the Union Army is holding the Confederate battle plan. And I don't like to use that. What I like to say is they're holding the Confederate playbook. It's not the play for the whole game. It's just a specific play that they're running, and Lee's specific play is the neutralization of Harper's Ferry. So McClellan now knows what to do with that. And another defending McClellan moment, we're gonna kind of attach this he doesn't really get moving kind of stigma to it. He's got that quote, I have here a paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I should be willing to go home. Meaning, if I can't beat Bobby Lee with this piece of information, I have no business even being here in this fight. And he does realistically get moving pretty quickly. He's got a big army, so the whole army doesn't get moving, but he gets enough of it moving that we got to give him credit for that, because the force that gets moving is a sizable and powerful force.
Right.
And they catch up with Robert E. Lee specifically at South Mountain, because somewhere along the line, Robert E. Lee has been made aware that this army is a lot closer, and they might have an idea as to where exactly we are. And so Lee is going to use the gaps in the mountains as a way to slow down this overwhelmingly large Union force at the time, because remember, they're divided. I think Lee's got somewhere between 18 and 22,000 guys, so he doesn't have a lot. Jackson's got about 23 to 25,000 guys. And McClellan's probably coming at him with anywhere between 70 to 90,000 effective fighters. This is a big, and depending on when you're talking in the days, because remember, the whole army doesn't get moving out of Frederick at once. But Lee knows that he's looking at a daunting foe coming at him, and so he's going to get into these gaps to try to slow everything down. The Battle of South Mountain rages on September 14th, 1862, right as Jackson's beginning to place his final guns and things around, Harper's Ferry. So you got to remember, guys, this isn't a linear story in the sense that one action after another. There is simultaneous stuff happening. So while Lee is moving into the gaps and McClellan is closing in on him, Jackson is also encircling Harper's Ferry. And realistically, with the kind of weaponry they're using on an artillery level, they are all within earshot of each other. So, Jackson, once the fighting is happening at South Mountain, is highly aware that he is now also on the clock. Stuff is going on.
Most definitely.
Yeah, and so the fighting at South Mountain is one of the first pretty big Union victories in the whole war at this point. I mean, there's been Union victories, but this is a big one because now the Union's on defense, technically, because the Confederacy's in their turf, in their home field. And even though that technically the Union is attacking in South Mountain, they're essentially defending their territory by trying to shoo away these invaders. And they do it very successfully, in fact, at South Mountain. It's a pretty significant Union win out there. And but it was only meant to be a delaying move. Like, Lee wasn't there looking for a victory to stymie this entire army. He's looking to buy time.
Right.
And so he's issuing, I shouldn't use that word. He's writing letters or notes or whatever. He's basically telling Jackson, I need you, to get to me, lickety, rickety, tickety, split. So Lee's going to successfully kind of slow down this army that is advancing on him. He's going to fall back to the Boonesboro-ish area on the evening of the 14th and 15th as things are going on. Jackson's going to encircle and absolutely just brilliantly capture Harper's Ferry the next day on the 15th. Dixon Miles, the federal commander, who is most likely in command there because he's on bitch duty. I don't know how else to describe it.
Wow.
He has been accused of being drunk on the battlefield earlier in this war.
Right.
He has a long military career, so they're not trying to just put him out to pasture. They're just kind of like, look, you're going to go get clean or whatever for 9 months, and then when you come back, we're going to give you a quiet detail. Because they're expecting this war to be done, or way down on the Virginia Peninsula. So action at Harper's Ferry, it's not supposed to be happening. So we don't really need you to be an effective commander. Just ride out your time on the clock and get your pension and go home kind of thing. And suddenly this guy is at the epicenter of everything. And Jackson's surrounding him. And all of Miles's guys are telling him, you got to get up on Maryland Heights. And he's like, we're supposed to defend the town. What? And he doesn't do it. And that's why I say use your brain. He doesn't go up there and really defend Maryland Heights. There's kind of like a piecemeal defense up there. And
they're thrown up there too late.
Yeah, that's what I mean. By the time he gets up there, it's nothing effective, and so the fight goes off. An artillery shell, I think, actually crashes through the building Miles is in and takes his leg off, and he ends up dying from that before Jackson even technically captures the whole city. And I think it's one of his subordinates that actually surrenders Miles's sword.
It's White. Yeah, Brigadier General White out of Martinsburg. Yeah.
So, so South Mountain has happened. The Union is right on the heels of the Army of Northern Virginia now. Harper's Ferry has fallen to Jackson, which with it a ton of supplies, uniforms, ammunition, food, things like that. And, two things. One, the cavalry guy, Ford, that got out, the Union cavalry guy. Grimes Davis. Why do I keep saying Ford?
Because he was the commander of Maryland.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, so Davis gets out to Frederick, and basically confirms to Little Mac all these things are going on. McClellan's like, okay, so there's real hot action. So, the army that had already been moving is now pushed a little further into moving quicker. Jackson simultaneously on the 15th sort of will get this, now that you got things tidied up, get yourself to me. So Jackson's going to take everybody in his army but A.P. Hill's guys. And they're going to start screaming towards Robert E. Lee around Boonesboro. And A.P. Hill's going to be left to sort of tidy things up at Harper's Ferry. And this is sort of where we transition to the meat of all this. The campaigns that we've covered, the action, the movements, the logistics, the politics, everything is now about to climax at what becomes the single bloodiest day in our nation's history. So if we led this off with, this campaign is possibly the most important single military campaign in our nation's history, by default, that makes the day we're about to have and talk about maybe the most important single day on our nation's history, because it makes the generational consequences possible. So now we're on September 16th, 1862, Kevin. We have a Confederate army that has made its position along the Antietam Creek. We have a federal army that is close by. There's been skirmishing on the night of the 15th into the 16th. It's kind of that deep breath we talked about earlier where everybody knows it's about to go down. What's happening on both sides of the football right now? We'll start with Lee, who has just watched a defeat and heard about a victory all at the same time.
So Lee's initial mindset is the night of September 14th, before he knows what's going on, knows really well what's going on at Harper's Ferry, at least, and Crampton's Gap, the southernmost gap at South Mountain, where there's action. Lee says, we're out of here. Mm-hmm. This campaign's over the night of September 14th, and he says, we're getting our army out of Maryland and back into Virginia, and then we'll reassess from there, because, to put it quite bluntly, George McClellan caught Robert E. Lee with his pants around his ankles. And that's exactly what Robert E. Lee actually says. But the morning of September 15th, a couple of things happen. When Lee arrives on the eastern bank of the Antietam Creek, firstly, he sees the terrain on the west bank, says it's pretty good terrain. Also, he realizes that by abandoning Maryland so quickly, that Lee is probably going to lose 20% of his army under Lafayette McLaws that's trapped in Pleasant Valley, north of Harper's Ferry. And so Lee decides to wait behind the Antietam just temporarily and see what he can make of this situation. And of course, once he finds out that Jackson has forced the surrender of Harper's Ferry, Lee realizes that if McClellan is not going to attack him immediately there at Sharpsburg, that Lee is going to have time to reunite his army, and then he can resurrect the campaign, so to speak. And so by the morning of September 16th, much of Jackson's command at Harper's Ferry is about to arrive, and so Lee has decided now that he is going to look for battle against the Army of the Potomac, because that's what he came here to do.
What an emotional roller coaster for Lee. We gotta go. Wait, we might have a chance to do this all in like a day.
It's easily probably the most stressful 24, 48 hours in Lee's military career, you could say. And throwing on top of that, he's riding in an ambulance at this point. One of his hands is broken, his other wrist is sprained.
True or false, boys? It's two or all three of the Confederate Big Three come across the river in an ambulance.
Three.
All three of them do, huh?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, it's
less glorious than you might imagine.
Yeah,
because very much bad omen.
Yeah, Lee had his bad fall where he caught himself and broke the one wrist and badly sprained the other. Jackson was thrown
from his horse.
Just after getting over the river.
Yes.
Yeah, I think somebody ran up to him and spooked his horse, and he got thrown. And then Longstreet's got a foot in a carpet slipper and is also in an ambulance because he's got a boil on the bottom of his foot. He can't walk on that. He certainly doesn't want to ride on it.
Man, just what an image, right? You think about these Confederate commanders and the way, especially with the 150 years of Confederate interpretation that we've had on the American Civil War. You don't ever really think of Lee, Longstreet, or Jackson as anything other than like gods amongst men on a battlefield, and here they are, kind of feeble and human with broken hands and sore bodies, and oh man, my foot, and it's not really glorious. Right. And I think it has a pretty significant effect on the campaign as a whole. But yeah, so I just thought that was an important thing to touch on.
Yeah. So Lee's finally going to be back in the saddle on September 16th, but even then, he still can't control his horse by himself. Right. He can ride on it, but it has to be led by somebody else because his hands still can't grab onto the reins of the horse and the bridle. So Lee's in a
So wait, that statue
situation
on the battlefield is totally not accurate? Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Not only is it in
the wrong place.
The wrong place because it's in federal lines. But yeah, Lee's
not majestic and holding his own reins or binoculars and looking awesome.
And there's even a very famous incident when A.P. Hill arrives on the battlefield and somebody tries to figure out whose flags those troops are carrying, and somebody is about to hand Lee a telescope. And Lee holds up his hands to say that I can't hold on
what are you doing,
and,
jackass?
Yeah,
like,
and the monument,
me?
and the monument there on the battlefield, too, Lee has him holding a pair of binoculars, and it's very clearly in the record that he could not do that while he was outside of Sharpsburg. So, but that's just the way it goes. Now, on the other side of the creek, McClellan is gathering up his army, and he's trying to figure out how to get at Robert E. Lee. the Antietam Creek is not something a lot of people will come to the battlefield today, depending on the weather, of course. If it had been raining a lot, then the creek looks very formidable. If it hadn't, then the creek is easy to cross.
Right.
But in September of 1862, by my estimation, it's anywhere from 3 to 4 feet deep. It's not something that can be crossed anywhere. And so, almost by nature, the creek forces McClellan into piecemeal plans and attacks, because he can't get his entire army across the creek at one point. He has to use natural bottlenecks, natural funnels, and so he has to figure out a way to get his army safely across, so that while it's in the process of doing so, Lee is not going to pounce on it. And you have to remember, we talked earlier about Lee's memory of the Mexican War and McClellan and these relationships that they have. Think about McClellan's mindset of what Lee has done to him just 90 days earlier at the 7 Days. What did Lee do? He pounced on him.
Right.
When McClellan's army was divided by the Chickahominy River, McClellan's army, in crossing the Antietam, is going to be divided, and he doesn't want Lee to pounce on that.
So McClellan's hearing ghosts right now, is what you're saying. So right now,
yeah, I think a little bit.
So
yeah.
McClellan is the Tom Brady after the New York Giants in Super Bowl 42. Tom Brady is just imagining Michael Strahan hovering around his head at all moments. So McClellan is sitting there going like, "Oh Jesus, Michael Strahan, Robert E. Lee is somewhere around me." Also, I want to be very clear. Robert E. Lee is not anywhere as great as Michael Strahan. Mike, if you're listening, because I know you're a huge fan of the History Things podcast and obviously History Things with Pat and all my work. I'm actually your biggest fan. I know you're my biggest fan, but thanks for your support and thank you for all your great years as a Giant at Super Bowl 42, baby. Love you.
You done?
Yeah, no.
Okay.
I can talk about it all day.
That's because I'm a Bills fan and I don't remember any of their Super Bowls. The Super Bowl that I cheered the hardest for anybody to win was actually the Giants when they beat the Patriots when they were 18-0.
We were all Giants fans.
Yes, I think we were. Yeah.
Yeah. Just sidebar. Kevin is a Bills fan and was born the same year that brilliant streak ended. When the Bills did lose 4 Super Bowls in a row. And last sports thing we'll say is, like, a lot of people crap on the Bills. We're trying to be good about cursing on this show, guys, by the way, because if anybody listening out there knows me personally, I have a terrible mouth, which you've heard some of it on this show. But the PG versions, I haven't said anything that you can't say on cable TV. But the Bills did lose 4 Super Bowls in a row, and people give them a lot of crap for that. But, they made it to 4 in a row. Like, that's insane. They made it to 4 straight.
Watch the ESPN 30 for 34 Falls of Buffalo.
So, there's some greatness in that. So Kevin is a Bills fan, and I try to put it on him from time to time because the Giants did beat the Bills in one of those 4. So right now, though, McClellan is hearing some ghosts because he's had this experience down on the Chickahominy and all this stuff. So what does he do about it?
Well, he's not just hearing some ghosts, but he has to solve a very difficult task of how to complete his objective of getting Lee out of Maryland. And so what McClellan will eventually do once he is able to reconnoiter all the positions, get his forces into position, is he'll send Joseph Hooker's First Corps, about 9,000 men, across the Antietam, the upper bridge, on the afternoon of September 16th. As they are stumbling into positions north of Lee's northern flank, they will come into contact in an evening fight. Not too dissimilar from the Bronner Farm, a lot less ferocious, certainly, in the East Woods on September 16th, but it only ends because of darkness.
Right.
And what settles over, we've talked about this a couple times, this bated breath. I mean, the night of September 16th just fascinates me.
They're listening to each other.
Yeah, you
Absolutely.
think, it's raining that night, it's miserable. Every single time, these soldiers they know they're within 100 yards of each other, they can hear each other. Any single time, a squirrel or whatever jumps off a tree and snaps a twig or jumps on a leaf, boom, somebody's going to shoot. What does everybody else do? They do that. Nobody's getting any sleep that night.
There's a lot of skirmish and picket fire that night.
A lot of picket fire.
And, Antietam is very rare when it comes to Civil War battles, in the sense that most of the time with these battles, you don't know when you're going to stumble into the enemy. And it's going to lead to a fight. July 1st at Gettysburg is, I think, the classic meeting engagement. Epitome of that. Every soldier, from the lowest private to the highest general, on the night of September 16th, they know what the next day is. And they all write about it. They all talk about what that was like and just how miserable of a night that was.
Right.
And, of course, it's this miserable night that's going to usher in, when the sun comes up, the bloodiest single day in American history. With Hooker renewing his attacks through the cornfield for about first hour and a half of the action, from about 6 to 7:30, and it's just it's of course a bloodbath. The first, really, of course, overall, we've talked about this, the bloodiest single day in American history, it's about 23,000 men killed, wounded, missing, or captured in 12 hours of fighting. You break down the math, it's about one person every 2 seconds.
Yeah, it's nuts.
For 12 straight hours.
It's
And
nuts.
yeah, the first hour of fighting in the cornfield, it's, we have 3,600 seconds in an hour. It's 4,300 casualties, so it's more than one person every second.
Two things I want to touch on real quick before we move on with Antietam is, one, the weather. Every time we talk about Antietam, I like to bring up this point because pop culture has just beaten this into submission, and I don't know how we even got here. Every time you see Antietam represented on film, you can see people's breaths. They make it seem like it's this weird cold weather battle because it takes place in mid-September, and in your mind, we're like, oh, it's fall. That's where we're supposed to have our pumpkin spice out because we're heading into pumpkin spice season. And in reality, guys, like, you're from Michigan and you're from upstate New York, but we've all been in this area for a long time now. So we know, in reality, it is blazing hot in the middle of September still in the mid-Atlantic. We're talking summer temperatures. We're not talking like, oh, it's in the mid-80s. Like, we're still talking high 90s sometimes at these points. Right. Worse than that, we're talking about high humidity levels at all times. All of us, I'm sure, can handle high heat. It's when things get nasty and sticky that it gets gross. And we have, armies meeting here in this mid-September fight after all of this chaos, all of this marching, all of this campaigning. This is the worst these two armies have looked because after these hard campaigns, nobody has spent a long time refitting and resupplying. That's what makes Harper's Ferry integral to the story here when we get there. We have this fight that's going to take place, and it's going to become what it's going to become, and all I can think about is like the Battle of Monmouth in the Rev War. The Revolution is like, this is a hot, nasty fight. Of all the battles to probably take place in, for many reasons, Antietam is one that I wouldn't want to take part in because of when it takes place. It's September in Maryland, and it's up against the watershed where you're having extra humidity in the area, plus all the fields are wet because it had been raining. And dude, I hate being hot and sticky. And that's something that the experience of the soldier was at this time. And two, a question I actually wanted to ask is the daylight savings time effect. I hear things like 5:30 and 7:30 a lot interchangeably, and I wonder how much that has to do with because we're using modern daylight savings time to reference the real time. So was it, just answer for me because I truly don't know, was it dark when this thing kicked off? Because it's dark at 5:30.
Yeah, it was dark.
Mm-hmm. So it was 7:30 because they weren't using daylight savings time, but in reality it was probably more like 5:30 our time today.
No, so we would be, I guess in September we're an hour ahead, so 6:30 our time in September is 5:30 historic 1862 time.
Okay, so they get
we're an hour ahead.
Okay, right. Yeah. So they get kicked off super early in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
So it's dark and foggy when the sun starts to come up.
Oh yes, yeah. One of the quotes from September 17th is that the fog, which had been very thick for several days at different points, never burns off. It's just replaced by gun smoke.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you see that during anytime there's an early morning living history demonstration at the battlefield with that humidity in September, the smoke just sticks.
Yep.
And you can't see anything. The fog sticks too, and it just made it a chaotic situation. Already visibility on that battlefield is terrible because of the terrain, but to factor in all that smoke, you're lucky to see 5-10 feet away from you at some points. And of course, trying to coordinate units, let alone coordinating a regiment of 300 guys itself would be difficult, but trying to coordinate thousands at the same time is incredibly difficult.
Interesting point you just made. There's a very famous historian who doesn't need my help promoting him, so I don't want to name drop him, but he made a really good point. I asked him in a conversation once, and I think he actually doubled down on it on a special or a documentary at one point. If you can look up the quote, you can figure out who I'm talking about. But he said he's often asked, what if they had machine guns? And he usually counters that with, what if there was one set of walkie-talkies on the field? And I think that's a really good point. What if you just had the ability on the ground at Sharpsburg and in Antietam to be like, hey, you're about to be flanked. And it's because you're standing on ground that, you can't see what's to your left 100 yards. And I think that Keith Snyder, actually, who's a ranger up there, when I was on I think it was the 152 tour it was because it was Ranger John Hoptack, who's now at Gettysburg. It was his Arrowhead Day at Antietam. It was his last day at Antietam. They gave him the Arrowhead. It was great. super emotional because I think he was like ready for it, but like when it actually happened, it was like I'm not actually ready for this, and it was cool and touching. But Keith talked about stand where you are and walk 100 yards in any direction and tell me what looks the same to you. And I didn't do it that day, but I did that a few different times in subsequent visits. And that is such a powerful thing because no matter what direction you move in, and what I did was like, I started at the visitor center up around the New York Monument. And I basically picked 6 locations from one spot at the New York Monument. And I walked about 100 yards in each direction, came back to the monument, did a new one. And the ground, you don't see anything the same way in any 6 of those spots. So a set of walkie-talkies in any situation there would have been way more impactful than any modern weaponry. And I think that's important. So, Kevin, we have hookers crashing through the cornfield, right? We got 3 pretty major assaults that go barreling through Miller's cornfield here. What is so significant about the fight in the cornfield that gives it some of its reputation?
It's perhaps one of the bloodiest square miles in all of North America. Probably within the first 4 hours of the action, from about 6 o'clock in the morning to roughly 10 a.m. There's close to 13,000 casualties within probably a 500-600 yard radius of the center of the cornfield. So it's not all in the cornfield itself, but I think the thing that really makes it famous is probably Joseph Hooker's quote after the battle, talking about that. He says, "In the time that I am writing, every stalk of corn was cut as closely as could have been done with a knife," and it just paints this this picture of, I think, that you have all these dead soldiers lying there. It's this constant back and forth struggle between Union and Confederate forces. But then you think about the Miller family too. I mean, they have 24 acres of corn ready to go
It's harvest
for
season.
their harvest, and all of a sudden they come back home and that's gone. And so I think that the cornfield is just to me at least, it symbolizes every aspect of the war, almost every aspect of the war. You have the civilian side of it. You have just this awful, terrible struggle back and forth, and it's again both sides. I mean, I think not only do both sides know what they're getting into that morning, but they know what it means.
Yeah.
For the Union Army, one more loss and they're done.
Yeah.
For the Confederacy, one more victory and they can see the light at the end of the tunnel. And so everybody is just fighting with all their power to win there.
S.D. Lee's artillery hell reference really speaks to me just because of the illustration of the chaos that is that fight. Imagine the listener out there, try to imagine like a square, and on 2 sides of the square you have Confederate infantry and artillery. You have Confederate artillery, and on the opposite 2 sides you have Union artillery, and then you go to the left and the right sides of the square, and you have Confederate and Union infantry facing off with each other, right? And once they get into the middle of this square, these artillery positions, which are framing this entire battlefield, they're opening up over top of all of this. So you're the line infantry approaching, and you are freaking out because this is the scariest thing you've ever been through in your life, after all the other scariest things you've been through, if you're lucky enough to have lived through the peninsula and everything to get to you here, or maybe you're one of the fresh, greener ones that have somehow not seen any battle on either side of this, and this is your first offering at seeing the elephant, and you're trying to keep your focus on the man, flesh and blood in front of you, who you can see his bayonet glinting, or maybe the corn has been chopped down enough through the fighting that you can see them now loading. And remember, this is the era of warfare where there's some poetic art, right? Your ability to win or survive depends on how well you can load and fire. I will survive if I can load and fire faster than you, because we're using the same stuff in the same drill, and all it just boils down to is the human tangible element. So that's chaos enough. Now try to imagine artillery raining all around you, and every type of artillery. There's canister being fired in this field. You have shell. You have solid shot being rolled in to just try to mass out troops. You have big Parrott guns across the river that are reaching, these Union Parrott guns that are reaching out and touching Confederate positions up on the hill by the Dunker Church, and where the New York Monument is now, where Parker's battery and S.D.'s Lee battery were. And these Union guns are so out of range of the Confederates that the Confederates just have to take that, and things like that. It's just chaos. So the S.D. Lee artillery hell, it really just speaks to me, because in a war of chaos, this is one of the most chaotic moments, I think. And I think that it just further hammers home the Hooker point of everything being cut so close. Like, the war was nothing but devastation and carnage, but this moment in it was especially heavy. And it just gets worse from there. Like, we're not over and done in Miller's cornfield. There's action on the east and west woods. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, the East Woods is really where the action started, you could say, but easily just as deadly as the area around the cornfield, and certainly I would think just as chaotic with in those woodlots. Talk about already the smoke hanging on the battlefield, even more so in those woodlots. It really must have clung.
A little precursor to the wilderness.
Yeah, absolutely. And chaotic, and then of course the West Woods. You get John Sedgwick's Union Division going in about 9:30 in the morning, roughly, and in 15-20 minutes, those 5,000 plus federal soldiers are streaming out of the woods. 40% casualties.
And this is where we're seeing what? This is where they run into Jackson's guys,
McLaws
and all them,
Walker
and this is
Walker,
where is this where the 15th Massachusetts gets chewed up by friendly fire?
Yes,
stuff like that.
Yeah.
And a lot of bad stuff happening in the West Woods.
Oh yeah, it was, and I think we don't have time to extrapolate on this, but I think that's maybe the most important event that takes place on September 17th, because of the foundation that it lays for Lee's mindset, McClellan's mindset, the rest of the day. But Sedgwick's division just gets absolutely chewed up of what happens there, and so from there the action about 10 a.m. It doesn't die down around the cornfield. There is still going to be some action there, but it starts to move further south to the Sunken Road and then Burnside Bridge as well, happening at the same time.
So I like talking about these phases because we get stuck in the linear mode. We have morning, midday, afternoon phase, and we think that they happen one after the other, but in reality they're happening kind of concurrently. So how do we transition from the cornfield down to the Sunken Road?
Well, the best way to put it is that the fighting that was occurring in the northern end of the battlefield when Kevin was talking was 3 major Union attacks. The 1st Corps, the 12th Corps, and the lead division, John Sedgwick's, of the Union's 2nd Corps. Corps, division.
Right.
Where's the rest of the 2nd Corps?
Right.
Okay. The Union 2nd Corps under Edwin Voss Sumner is approximately 15,000 troops, broken up into roughly 5,000 men per division. Roughly. Sedgwick's division's gone in. There's 10,000 more troops. Where are they? They're still coming up.
Right.
This is going to be French's division and Israel Richardson behind him. They're actually going to be moving up from the Antietam Creek, moving east to west, following in the wake of Sedgwick's advance. But when French gets to the area of the East Woods, kind of on the edges of it, closer to Moomaw Farm, he's looking around. He can't see the guys he was supposed to be following.
A lot of this is because of the chaos of the battle, but also the chaos of the terrain. It's
right, exactly.
Jacking everything up.
Yes. Sedgwick's division has gone up and over the Sharpsburg Ridge. They've plunged down into the West Woods on the other side. Where are they? Where's the guys we're supposed to be following? What he can see amongst all the smoke and the confusion and the burning friggin' farmstead that is Moomaw Farm at this point is a thin blue line up in the middle of Sharpsburg Ridge, about where the visitor center is today. It's actually elements of the 12th Corps that have gone over there, George Green's division. French, understandably, and Kevin, if you've got insights on this, feel free to jump in, but French very understandably thinks, okay, I was ordered to be on the left of the Union line. The left of the Union line is actually now to the south of me from what he can see, and he is going to swing his division around, 5,000 troops approximately, and begins moving towards what we now know as the Sunken Road. He'll be moving past the burning Moomaw Farm, down towards the Roulette Farm, heading for this next Confederate line. Want to pick it up there with why we've got a line there at the Sunken Road?
Yeah, so the Sunken Road position is, I think, often thought of as, people compare it to like a World War I trench almost.
Right.
And it's really not that. For the Confederates, it depended on where they were in the line, but ultimately it was used originally as a path for Confederate troops from the center of Lee's line to work their way up towards the northern end of the battlefield. And by the time the Federal successes of the 1st Corps and 12th Corps that Matt referenced take the Dunkerchurch Plateau, then the last two brigades of D.H. Hill's division are stuck down there in the sunken road. They decide, it's not too prudent to go forward when everybody on their side is streaming back towards the road itself. And of course, a roadbed is a great place to rally your troops. So D.H. Hill will stand there in the sunken road with about 2,500 men, two brigades of Alabamians and North Carolinians, and about 9:30, again, the same time that the fighting is really picking up in the West Woods, and the same time that Burnside is starting to stir down on the southern end of the field, the fighting will pick up in the sunken road. And it's a very different style of fighting than the cornfield. It's repeated Union assaults. Confederate troops will be counterattacking out, but it's not so much back and forth as the cornfield. It's a lot more static.
It's position based.
Yes, very much so. And those positions the Federals are actually on higher ground in many cases, on a ridgeline overlooking the sunken road, and that's why the Confederates are trying to get out of it, trying to attack out of it, is drive those.
They
Federals
realize
off
they get
that
here and they're
ridge.
like, we made a very bad mistake.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And the terrain as well in the sunken road just serves to compartmentalize the Confederate defenses there, and confusion takes hold again when you're trying to coordinate thousands of troops surging forward at the same time. You can't see if the guys on your left have gone. You can't see if the guys on your right have gone. And ultimately, that's going to be one of the things that leads to the Confederate withdrawal from the sunken road.
Yeah, you have, I think there's some bugle call for, like, fall back for one unit, but a different unit answers it. And, like, we have these, should I stay, should I go? It's like the Clash.
Yep.
Should I stay or should I go now? Like, we have no idea what we're doing. And the line here, this is where the Irish Brigade gets some of its reputation. They do
Certainly.
pretty well on the field here. We talk about a lot of the anxieties of the battle. I think one of the most anxiety-laden parts of this battlefield is the Confederates and the Union soldiers in the attack at the sunken road. As you imagine being a Confederate in this position, you probably know isn't a great one at this point, but you can also now hear this column, or this battle line rather, approaching you. You can hear the jingling of all the haversacks and the other accoutrement you're wearing. You can hear the steady of the marching, and you can hear the non-coms, doing all the yelling, and then suddenly the tops of the flagpoles appear over the crest, because that once you've seen them in the distance and they disappear in that swell, the next time you see them, they're going to be right on top of you. There is going to be no, oh, well, I see them again, but now we get a minute. The next time you see them, it's, here we go, boys. And that's insanely tense. And it obviously it goes the way it goes. It goes from the sunken road to the bloody lane in this action. And, the Irish Brigade, is it the Irish Brigade that flanks them and ends up shooting down the lane? Or is it just the second
brigade
corps?
to come up, behind the
Caldwell's.
Irish Brigade.
So it's Caldwell's guys that do the
Brigade,
actual flanking?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How long does the fighting down at the sunken road go on for?
About the
Matt and I
same,
would probably, give
about
different
the
answers
same
because-
amount of time as the fighting at the bridge will occur.
Mhm,
About
yeah.
9:30 in the morning to about 1.
So again, not happening linear. It's happening concurrently. Like we
Yep.
have hot action, pretty much in all three phases of this battlefield. The morning phase is kind of winding down, but there's still stuff going on.
Absolutely.
But we have hot action in 2 out of 3 places, pretty much simultaneously the whole way here. We have some pretty notable casualties. We have Richardson is mortally wounded. We have that weird scene in Gods and Generals where General Richardson is wounded, afraid it's serious, that whole thing. And, and then we have, that's how Hancock becomes Hancock. Is that how he becomes Hancock the Superb? Not
at
in this
Williamsburg.
moment, but it's sort of like Hancock the Superb is now running the Second Corps.
Yep,
We lose one of the Andersons on the Confederate side of things.
George B. Yeah,
There's a bajillion of them. We lose one of them here.
Yep.
John B. Gordon is going to be shot so many times it could have killed 5 George Andersons. But instead, John B. Gordon is apparently so badass he'll survive all of that.
True.
And be around to be a part of a pretty spectacular scene at Appomattox Courthouse a few years later. And man, John Gordon shot 5 times. Like, that's just incredible. And that's not the only times in this war he's going to get shot or wounded. Like, John Brown Gordon is a friggin' bullet magnet. If I was in his command, I wouldn't want to stand anywhere near him when the lead started flying, because he has shown nothing that says he's safe. And I don't know if that's leading from the front or whatever it is, but that guy gets wounded. And just, before we move on to sort of the afternoon phase of this, there's a letter from an unnamed soldier. I don't know if it's unnamed because the person that published it just didn't do the research, or we couldn't find it, or we just don't know who wrote it. But there's a letter from a soldier in the 130th Pennsylvania who basically talks about his time on the field at the Sunken Road. He's sent in for what is, I guess, the Union Army is the way they're engaging units is supposed to be like half-hour style rotations, I guess. They put them in, and after 30 minutes, they kind of try to pull them out and rotate another unit in. But it doesn't always go that way. That's the ideal, I guess, way of going about things.
They're burning through their ammunition at about that time.
Right. So what ends up happening here is a bunch of these units get cut off, and some of them are engaged for several hours. And so this letter basically states that this 130th Pennsylvania is engaged for roughly 4.5 to 5 hours. And he takes 89 rounds out on the field with him. It's not enough. He ends up taking another like 30 or 40 off a dead man, and ends up returning with only like 3 rounds in his pocket. Like, again, you can't compare the living history that we do to the real action, but I mean, the mechanics of loading and firing, and there are some Rangers that'll let you burn powder, and you want to do independent fire, and you want to crank out as many rounds as you can between, fire and ceasefire. I mean, I've hauled off with loading, and I've traditionally they'll let you fire 1 to 2 rounds before they call ceasefire, and I've gotten 5 shots off before. And like, that was nuts. Firing over 100 rounds, I guarantee you a couple things. One, that wasn't the same rifle the entire time.
No.
0% chance of that. And 2, like, that had to have been the craziest, no matter what his war experience was, that had to have been the most crazy moment in the war for him. Because 5 hours, and up where they were, 130th PA is up there with the 5th Maryland, I think. Mm-hmm. They're out there. There's nowhere to hide. There's no exposure unless you're on the military crest side of the hill, and you're engaged. Your command's not letting you hunker down on that side of the hill. So you're 5 hours hiding behind your dead mates. You're hiding behind the little scraps of trees that are left up there. Just what a crazy scene of chaos. And I kind of come back to this point in any war we study. I just to live through it. Unbelievable. And it's not even over here, right? So like, we're down at this is one of my favorite parts of the battlefield because it's often misinterpreted and it's often unexplored or very, very little explored by comparison to the other parts of the battlefield. But we have in the afternoon phase, kicking off around 8:30, 9:30 in the morning, we have some orders that are essentially, to get across the river and strike Lee on his right. And how does that go?
Not terribly well. At least initially. I can expand on that, I guess. But
end of podcast. Thanks. That was good. Yeah. That was good.
That's all you need to know.
Yeah.
But somewhere between, the Civil War time, just like Civil War arithmetic is a very inexact science, so somewhere between 9 o'clock in the morning and 10 o'clock in the morning, the first Union assault begins on the Burnside Bridge, or what comes to be known as the Burnside Bridge. And immediately it doesn't go off well.
Or is it Rohrbach Bridge at the time?
Yeah, Rohrbach or
Lower Bridge.
Yeah, yep. The first attack on the bridge does not go off well. The 11th Connecticut gets shot pretty badly, losing their commanding officer, Henry Kingsbury. The 11th Connecticut was supposed to support a couple of regiments of Ohioans under the command of future Indian fighter George Crook.
Right.
And when Crook gets his orders to attack the bridge, supposedly his response was, "What bridge?"
Right.
And he ends up about 300 yards north of the bridge. There's a lot of debate as to why that is and who dropped the ball on that one, but the first attack fails. To the Ninth Corps' credit, I think they try some innovative tactics. They try a storming column.
Yep.
2nd Maryland and 6th New Hampshire. Yeah, 6th New Hampshire. Moving right up the Roarsville Road. Not stopping to fire. They're just expected to charge and go straight across the bridge. Good idea, but they're exposed to fire the whole way, and the column breaks up before they even make it to the bridge. And so by noon, Burnside is constantly getting messages from McClellan's headquarters saying, "You got to get across. You need to get across. Get across.
Do it. Get to the chopper."
Yeah, there you go. That's right. And
get to the chopper.
Finally, Burnside is going to turn to two pretty experienced units. The 251st, as they're ever after known, 51st Pennsylvania New Yorkers, and they will carry the bridge at about 1 p.m. But by the time they got there, I think it was pretty softened. At that point, the Confederates have been, just like that soldier you referenced, the 130th Pennsylvania, those Georgians had been firing
all day.
Yeah, for 3-4 hours. They're tired, exhausted, running out of ammunition. Also, those Ohioans that were north of the bridge finally started getting their way across.
Yeah, they figured out what they're doing.
Yeah.
Good job, Ohio.
South of the bridge, too.
Yeah, south of the bridge, Isaac Rodman starts coming across. So by 1 p.m., the bridge is now in Burnside's hands for of course, whom it's named for.
Yeah, but this isn't where the fight ends. This is one of the things I like, because I recently discovered a lot. I didn't discover it, but my mind got opened up to a lot more of the end of this fight than I had previously sort of understood. And we for a previous History Things with Pat project explored a captain of the 35th Massachusetts whose unit is going to come sweeping across the bridge right after the dual 51st. And we're talking about Captain Tracy Cheever of the 35th Mass. And
you do like him.
I love that story, man. It's a cool story. It took me to a part of the battlefield I'd never really explored, because it might sound stupid or arrogant or whatever. Like, I'm busy. Like, I'm busy. So when I'm a parent, I'm a full-time, construction contractor. I do run History Things with Pat, which History Things podcast is just another cool wrinkle in that overall umbrella. So the other things in that umbrella are big and time-consuming. So when I do get out to a place, I got to have a mission focus. Like, if I'm going to Antietam for a research reason or whatever, like, I got to go do what that is. I very seldomly have, like, tourist time where I can just kind of F off and go explore what I want. And then in discovering Cheever's story, to be very fair, I wasn't there as a tourist to figure it out. We were there intentionally to talk about Cheever and this experience, which, I was glad, because it took me to the final assault, and I got to see... I'd never seen Lee's artillery reserves from the perspective that I got to see them for, and it really changed how I understood the end of the battle. And seeing just how far the Union assault actually goes once they're on the other side of the bridge, like, it doesn't just end once they hit the Georgian Overlook. I mean, it basically carries another mile, or like 3/4 of a mile up, up, I don't know what that area actually is, but, we run into another sunken road. Trivia fact for you: there are 2 sunken roads,
at least,
on what is now modern day Antietam National Battlefield. Obviously, at the time, it was just Antietam Battlefield, because they weren't, preserving these things in real time. Like,
well, that's a very serious question, though, is why were all Civil War battlefiels fought on national parkland?
Well, how else would they know where to fight, guys?
That's right, I know.
Jeez, duh.
I'm just glad they protected the monuments.
Yeah, I know, right?
We must, here you imagine like a little Mac delivering some speech. We must defend the Pennsylvania Memorial. It is quite grand. And Reynolds is like, yeah! And that's why he dies.
Yeah.
No. But, there's a whole lot to unpack and explore there that takes place after. And the Civil War is full of these misconceptions. Like, at first Manassas, which I focus on a lot, you get this impression that Jackson runs through Ricketts and Griffin's guns and the fight's over. No, the fight goes on for like 2 or 3 more hours, and the guns change hands. The Union loses them, they win them back. They lose them, they win them back, and this goes on for a while. So, here, Burnside doesn't just get across the bridge and we're like, well, that was it. And Lee's like, screw, we got to go. He's going to run into, and this is where the Harper's Ferry aspect of the story is going to come back into play. So we have all these units getting across now, right? We have a pretty forceful Federal pursuit of what is looking to be like an ever-retreating Confederate army. We have the Georgians and North Carolinians are all falling back. Lee's artillery reserves, which are where the modern-day National Cemetery is, have all sort of been called up into action. They're not just in reserve anymore. They're being placed, and they're opening up. And this battle's moving into a sunken road, and things are actually looking like, ready for this, like how we kind of started this? The war could end here. Like we have the Confederacy, not the Confederacy as a whole, but we have the largest, most symbolic Confederate army on the run, if you're looking at this in a certain light. They came into Maryland, they campaigned to a intention of kind of scaring the Union populace, relieving the pressure on the North, and we want to be up here for a while. And within like 3 weeks, it's all fallen apart. There's been a major, at the time it wasn't considered major, but in retrospect, South Mountain's a major Union victory. It shows that the North can win, and it shows that Lee is not immoral. And then now this fight, which has been equally bloody on both sides, is starting to look more and more like an outright Union victory. And because of these things, we're in a, quote, foreign land, and Lee's got to get out of Dodge, and we're going to kind of start to maybe not as a whole cohesive Confederate Army unit get across this river. Like, this looks like an opportunity to smash the Army of Northern Virginia, which would be like crushing the soul of the Confederacy at this point, because now Lee has got a reputation. You know,
Well, he's beginning to build it, yeah.
but he's got it. And I'm not saying it's like the 63 Lee reputation where, you know, it's like, it's all my fault. And they're like, no, it isn't. like, you didn't mess this up, General Man. Like, this is our fault. Like, we're like, Lee's like this god on a horse kind of thing. But this is the beginning of it. And he is enjoying a small bit of it here. So, like, you know, we're staring down another potential end to this war. And it doesn't happen because we know that this war ends in a couple different capacities, but symbolically April 9th, 1865. So here we are on September 17th, 1862, and we're talking about a potential where end of the war could be in sight. What happens once they get across this bridge? Things are going so well. Why does it not end today?
Well, it takes Burnside a couple of hours to get all of the Ninth Corps, most of the Ninth Corps, across the bridge, and I think that's pretty understandable. You know, it's a bottleneck. It's only 12 feet wide or whatever the bridge is, and you can't get everybody across at once.
Yeah, literally the only people that give Burnside crap for this getting across the river thing are people that just don't want to do any basic research, or they've never been there. They've just never stood there and looked at it. That's it. That's simple. You either aren't doing your job as a researcher because the information isn't a deep dive, it's right there, or you've never stood there and seen it for yourself because it's not like a modern bridge. It's the same friggin' bridge. So, you know, you could barely drive a car across it.
Yeah.
You want to put 12,000 guys across it? Good job. Have fun.
Yeah, and, you know, some of his troops that have fought to take the bridge are out of ammunition, so they need to be replaced on the line. But finally, by about 3:15, 8,000 Union soldiers are surging forward towards the southeastern corner of Sharpsburg. They're ready to, as you mentioned, Pat, cut Lee off from the Potomac River, really crush the right end of Lee's line. And a lot of different things conspire to make sure that doesn't happen. I'd say one is the terrain. You two have talked about walking that terrain. Get out there and walk it, because that really changes your whole perception
100%.
of that end of the battlefield.
100%.
Do it in 75-degree heat. Do it in wool if you want. I mean, you'll regret it, but
you'll
learn a lesson.
appreciate it in a different way too.
You'll learn a lesson. And then I think Lee too is able to cobble together a line that is able to repulse the men of Burnside's command that make it up close to the Harper's Ferry Road. And then, of course, on top of that, the cherry on top is A.P. Hill's division arriving from Harper's Ferry after a 14-mile march in about 9 hours and arriving at pretty much the right place at the right time. So all of those things conspire and you could probably say some bad luck that, you know, Burnside must have been born with, to conspire to drive him back, not across the bridge, but back to the bridge itself.
Right.
And so by 5:30, 6 o'clock in the evening, the battle comes to an end. Not quite yet dark, but both sides are
just done.
Yeah,
We're done.
they're exhausted.
What a moment, right? You know, you're thinking, man, we're winning this war. Like, not the battle, but like you're thinking maybe this war, and you see this like group of blue guys start rolling up on this hill, and you're like, yeah, these guys are gonna flank these guys with us. And then all of a sudden their flags come out and they unload into you because you weren't expecting a whole bunch of Confederates in blue to show up. And that's what I think is super important. It's not like that's the whole plan or the whole scene, but I think it's important to know that there was enough supplies in uniforms at Harper's Ferry that these armies that do look terrible because they've been doing all this campaigning and forced marching, the guys who have the ability to take advantage of those newly acquired uniforms start doing so. I don't imagine there's a ton of guys in outright full Union kits, but I mean a blue coat on some dirty pants that are, you can't tell, because look, let's be real, after campaigning like they've been campaigning, some sky blue trousers are looking dusty and gray. Some are looking because they've got crap and mud all over them, right? So a blue coat and a gray or brown coat are easy to identify, but the pants not so much. But maybe you see a column of a bunch of guys in blue coats start to show up, and you're thinking nothing about it. And until they fire into you, and then you look a little harder, and then the flags are different, and their pants are different, their hats are different, and you're like, oh, Jesus. And I think that's important because that does catch a lot of the Union that's in the area off guard. And it also helps validate a really important piece of this story for McClellan. McClellan has been getting some interesting intelligence. That was a diplomatic way of saying bad intelligence. For not just this campaign, but the Peninsula campaign as well. He is always of the belief that he's the inferior force in terms of numbers. He believes he's up against 200,000 Confederates, and Lee's got this endless supply of guys somehow, this magical Confederate army that can just materialize reinforcements out of nowhere. And when these guys show up out of nowhere at the end of the battle, seemingly fresh, but McClellan doesn't know they just force marched 17 miles and they're gassed. But these guys just showed up, and that freaks McClellan out, and he thinks there is these big reinforcements out there potentially, which is why there might be some willingness to kind of de-throttle immediately. Like, this fight has been crazy. It is over, and we don't know what's about to come next, so rally around the flag and let's figure out what's going on. And I think that's a hell of a way to conclude the most terrible day in our nation's history, because you combine Pearl Harbor and Oklahoma City, World Trade Center 93, World Trade Center 2001, and the embassy bombings that happened in the late 90s, and you combine them all together, and they're still not as bloody of a day as Antietam was. And we are so desensitized to what that devastation would be. But like, the context I try to provide for everyone is this: in the current world we live in, and I've used this example on previous podcasts, so if you followed along, great. And there are rules to this analogy, right? So I'm going to reference the current political administration, and we're not talking about politics, but right after the current president took over, there was a military raid that had been set up by the previous administration and carried out by the current administration that successfully wrapped up, but it resulted in the death of one American service member. Special Forces, Navy SEAL, lost their lives. And our entire nation mourned it. And rightly so. Like we live in a world, and I was raised, and I'm sure we all raised, with a deep appreciation and gratitude for our American servicemen and women. But as historians, I think we come with a different realism that, like, this is war that we're studying, and people die in war. And these people volunteered for whatever reasons. Some people join the military for varying reasons. Today, in antiquity, to go to school, to adventure, to fight, whatever. But no matter what, one thing's the same: is signing that line means you're willing to die for it. For me, for you, for a stranger, whatever. And one American service member unfortunately lost their lives, and our entire nation grieved about it. I mean, it was a big deal. One guy. Here, we're talking about 23,000 dead, wounded, missing in a single 12-hour span of time on a nondescript farmland here in Maryland. This Navy SEAL died in Yemen, in a foreign land, right? And we rightfully grieved him. We lost our minds about it. We couldn't handle 23,000. Like, our society today is not built to handle it. The First World War, the Second World War, Vietnam, Korea, like, we couldn't handle those casualties. By comparison, the Afghan and Iraq wars that our generation has been a part of are relatively casualty small. I mean, I think there's only 5,000 deaths, or a little over, between 5,000 and 6,000 deaths in the Afghan war, which
I think it's approaching 7,000 between the two.
But even so two wars combining to around 7,000. We'll say 8,000 to be safe, just to be safe, right? Obviously, the casualty number, because you include the wounded, is far greater. But the deaths, outright, just the deaths of the two wars we are living through right now, are less than 10,000. And we're talking, these wars are almost 20 years old. Like 2 decades, like almost your entire life. Like, you were 9 years old when we engaged in the first of these wars. Like, that's insane. Now, you're a grown-ass man now. You're married with a great career. But that entire time you've been building your life, we've been in this war, and we've only had, combining it, less than 10,000 deaths. Here, the American Civil War as a whole claims between 600,000 and 800,000 lives, depending on your source, which you modern day that out, it's like 2.3 million Americans. One guy dies in Yemen. We lost our friggin' mind. We couldn't handle 23,000 in a day. We couldn't handle 2.3 million Americans in 4 years. This is a different world we're talking about. And when we go back to the point we're making about this whole importance and significance, symbolism of this campaign and the weight it carries, this is the beginning of the new world we live in. And I think that's awesome. It comes at a terrible price. But hindsight being 2020, knowing all the things we know now about politics and intentions and causes and playouts and the evolution of our nation and civil rights, and just I'm happy it happens, because what would our world be like if we didn't engage in this struggle as a whole, but this day? Does this war continue in these weird, very bloody, but not this bloody kind of ways? Because this is a statement for both sides.
Certainly.
Both sides walk away from this with just like after First Manassas, with like, what just happened? Like, nobody walks away from this like, yeah. Like, nobody. I mean, it scares everybody, because now it's like we just up the ante. Like, First Manassas was upping the ante from like, we're going to talk a whole bunch of trash, to like, holy crap, we actually fought and like didn't end it. And now we're like, holy crap, like we just killed everybody and it didn't end it. So what do we have to do to get there now? And I think that this is another overall deep breath, because now I think this is where we really settle into the war. Like, this, to me, this war has no chance of ending until it actually ends. Like, here, I thought for a moment in researching that this war could have ended right here. You know, a couple things go differently at the end. Maybe AP Hill's guys don't show up. Maybe the wagon trains with the ammunition can get across a little better, and Burnside's able to keep up his pursuit. Realistically, I think he does catch up to Lee. And I know that we're going to get into Shepherdstown in a minute. We're going to reserve the Loudon campaign for our next episode. But, you know, one of the things that I'll touch on, and we'll get into it in the next episode, is like, there is this misconception that Lee's going to get trapped against this river and it's too high and he can't get there, and like, why doesn't McClellan attack? And we'll cover all that in a minute, but like, let's just say that Burnside's able to keep going. He might actually catch Lee against that river, and the war could end there. But once it doesn't happen, there is no, okay, short answer, we'll find the next quick opportunity to end it. I think this is the moment where both sides just go attrition. Like, this is where I think total war really creeps in for both sides. I don't necessarily believe this is where like the Sherman aspect or something, but I think this is just where both sides really resign themselves to the fact that this isn't going to be over soon. That the Confederacy still has a strong will to fight, and the Union can now play on the field. Because up until this point, the Union hadn't been able to really hold their jockstrap, right? The Confederacy had rolled up and won almost every single one of these big fights. Like, if the Union does win, you know, if you line this up, wins and losses, the Union is putting W's in their win columns. For sure. Especially out west. But, you know, we're focusing on the East. And they are winning here and there in the East. But the fights that really matter are getting put in the Confederate win columns. And so that's where this demoralization, this, you know, this whole Union, like, kind of, we don't really support the war, and now we're supporting it less because we're involved and we're losing. Like, is it worth it? And like, and then this major thing happens, right? Remember I said we hadn't been plugged into this war, so nobody was really rah-rah or anti. It was just kind of like, Alexander Gardner's on the field. He's going to take a photo or two, or 20, or who knows how many, but he's going to take a bunch of photos.
80,
was it 80?
Yeah,
a lot
80,
of pictures.
Yeah.
He's going to take a bunch of pictures of the aftermath of this battlefield. Now, it's not the exact aftermath. It is in some places. Like, there's that famous picture of the Hagerstown Pike, where I'm sure those men are right where they fell. And then there's other pictures where you can see burial details of sort of to collect the dead, and they're like laid out in rows to be buried. And but these pictures are taken on behalf of Matthew Brady, right? Because I want to be very clear here. Alexander Gardner works for Matthew Brady. He's, I guess, an employee of his. So Matthew Brady will get credited with these a lot, but he didn't actually take a single one of these pictures personally. These are all taken by Alexander Gardner and his assistant. And these photos will go on display in October of 1862 at Matthew Brady's studio in New York, I believe it is. Even though I think Matthew Brady's based out of D.C.
He's got, the two galleries.
He's got the big ones in New York, I think, right? So either way, it doesn't matter. The photos go on display, and this is the first time the general public gets to really see the war. And they're horrified. And this is where the first time the governments of both sides and the citizen populations of both sides realize what the armies have known all along. That this is going to go for a while, and it is going to be awful, and it's going to be worse in every subsequent offering. Every battle will be worse than the one before it, and I think that really speaks to how the Overland Campaign plays out, because that's where we are outright bought into this war of attrition. It's going to get worse because everything just gets bloodier and bigger and heavier. And that's an interesting time. But this campaign doesn't also end technically in this moment where Burnside calls it a day, McClellan calls it a day, Lee calls it a day, right? We have action that takes place on the 19th and 20th. On the 18th, McClellan's kind of trying to see what Lee's going to do, and Lee's trying to see what McClellan's going to do. And Lee is preparing for another attack. And I think McClellan is, on some degree, preparing for an attack.
Mm-hmm. Certainly.
But it doesn't happen. But on the 19th and 20th, there's action. And that's actually action happening in the area where you went to college.
Yep, yeah. So this was going back to the start of the podcast. That battlefield trip down to Shepherdstown. But it's a very intriguing battle. I think it's not the largest battle, only about 10,000 men, but I think it's very important in its scope and what happens because of it. But essentially, Lee will withdraw from Sharpsburg the night of September 18th, go across the Potomac River, and his campaign is not done. He plans on re-entering Maryland in the area of Williamsport. But what ends up happening is McClellan will actually pursue Lee to the river. Union troops will cross the Potomac the night of September 19th, scatter Lee's rear guard. The commander of that rear guard, William Nelson Pendleton, Lee's chief of artillery.
Sandy Pendleton's dad?
Yeah, Sandy Pendleton's dad.
Man.
Yeah. He doesn't have his finest day.
No.
He certainly very mistakenly tells Lee that basically the entire rear guard has been captured, including all 44 guns that were there. In reality, the
not
Union
Matthew,
Army,
Mark, Luke, and John.
No.
Please say it's not so.
No, but one of the guns that was captured was actually from VMI.
Oh.
That had been borrowed, and that very day, actually, when they were lost, VMI wrote a note to Pendleton saying, "We want the gun back."
Oh, he's like, yeah,
Right.
about
I've never found his response.
about
but,
that gun, guy.
Yeah, I'm sure he was kind of like, hey, yeah.
Overdue
But,
library books, outstanding guns. There's
That's right.
there's a tab.
He was allowed back in Lexington later on in life, so I
I'm
guess
sure.
it's okay.
I'm sure.
But Pendleton tells Lee, that there's this unknown Union force in our rear. Lee has to assume that it's a large Union force because all 44 of his guns have been captured. In reality, it's only 4 guns. So Lee puts the brakes, slams on the brakes for his army moving to Williamsport, has to turn it around back towards Shepherdstown. There's a battle fought there the next day between a Union reconnaissance that's sent across the river and A.P. Hill's division once again arriving. Right place, the right time for the Army of Northern Virginia. And so the Battle of Shepherdstown is ironically a Confederate victory. The Federals are driven back across the Potomac River. But 2 things happen. Firstly, Lee's bridgehead at Williamsport gets closed off by George McClellan. That bridgehead was established by Jeb Stuart. And then the other thing is Lee realizes that his army is done.
Yeah.
He has run the wheels off his army. It is not reacting to him. It's not reacting to its commander's orders. And so Lee realizes that his army needs to take a break. And McClellan realizes the same thing. And you think about it, these armies have pretty much been fighting and marching nonstop for the last 3 months.
Yeah.
Right.
And they've just been pushed beyond the limits of human exertion, human endurance, and they
They're
need
done. They're
time
tapping out.
to rest, refit, reorganize, and get ready for the next campaign.
And so Lincoln is going to use this as an opportunity to shift the focus of the war. And this is where we get in, and we'll start the wrap up on this, right? This is where we transition into the second part of the overall story where we turn our eyes towards Fredericksburg later in the year. So Lincoln's going to, earlier in this year, have wanted to issue an Emancipation Proclamation, which would free all the slaves held in the states which are in rebellion at this point. And he wants to do this, I believe, as early as like May or June. Maybe
July is
July. And it's Gideon Wells. Is it somebody, or is it somebody in his administration is like, this is going to be viewed as desperate?
Seward.
It's Bill Seward.
The Secretary of State.
So Bill Seward is going to tell him, like, this is going to be viewed as desperate. If you do this now, because you're getting your ass handed to you, this is going to look like a desperation move, and that will absolutely bring in all the validation for the enemy that, if you're looking desperate, your rebel army is going to get some clout, and some foreign intervention is way more likely. So he's convinced not to issue it, and he's convinced wait till you got something to couple it with, like a Union victory. Now, tactically, Antietam is a draw, I guess, because Lee is ceding some of the ground. He's not being driven off of all the ground. It's one of the weird gray areas of the war, like we were talking about on the peninsula. People are winning but willingly leaving the ground behind. So I tend to put it more in the draw because there is no decisive, we just wiped the battlefield.
I'd still call it a Union victory because of objectives.
So that's what I was getting ready to say is
Okay.
the Union I would put it in the Union category, though, because the Union does knock down all the bowling pins it sets up objective-wise, or most of them, enough to claim it as a victory. But the victory is what's important for McClellan, or for Lincoln, because Lincoln will now use this as the catalyst or catapult to put his Emancipation Proclamation out there, which is going to be a major part of the Fredericksburg storyline in a different level, but on the bigger, generationally consequential level. Like, this is where the war goes from being about the preservation of the Union as it is existing at the time, all current institutions intact, i.e., the institution of chattel slavery in the United States. Meaning Lincoln, up until this point of the war, has just been trying to keep it all together.
Right.
And that's it. Not keep it all together and X, Y, or Z. It's just keep it together. But he realized somewhere along the way that the status quo, that couldn't be. And the war now shifts in this moment to being a war of preservation of the Union, to a war that is about preserving a new Union, creating a new world with the really, we're going to start to ask ourselves, what does all men are created equal actually mean? And we're going to turn this into a war of emancipation, which is going to do a lot as far as international concern for this war, because where we are potentially teetering on the brink of the First World War, which is a weird thing to say, because in the decade prior, we just had the Crimea, which is a world war. We just had, in the century prior, the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, which is a world war.
Right.
All the powers that you're going to talk about in the actual First World War are in those wars too. So this is weird. But the American Civil War, we literally have foreign powers about to get involved. And if that happens, other foreign powers are likely to get involved, because we are in our weird area as an 80-ish year old nation, right? We're
stepping out onto the world
stage.
stage.
And we have all eyes on us. And we have a lot of good things going for us as a country. So if we look weak and pickable, the vultures of the big elite aristocracies of the world will very likely swoop in and, pick apart the cadaver of the defunct U.S. if it doesn't work out. So we're teetering on the edge of big stuff. And when the Emancipation Proclamation is issued and the war shifts to this moral focus now, it keeps a lot of that in check, because England, especially England, right? England has freed their slaves before our revolution's even underway. Like, they have clarified. I see your hands. Do it.
1807, England, the same year that the United States does, actually, England outlaws the slave trade.
Right.
Okay. There's still slavery within the empire, though.
But in England itself.
England itself, no.
Right.
Right. On the home islands, no.
Right.
England and France outlaw slavery in their empires in the 1830s, specifically 1833, and then it goes into effect in 1834.
See why we don't minutia every rabbit hole, guys? Because we can do this for days. Which I do want to get on to the British Empire at some point, because it's a great topic. You get things like the sun never set on the British Empire is great, and you can go down rabbit holes where you can ask yourself just how much responsibility the English Empire has for the current state of the world, which is a fun thing. But another day, boys and girls. But here we are with all of these foreign powers who were licking their chops and potentially getting involved, now see this moral state that the war is now in. And England is not, and France are not going to be supporting a confederacy that they might have sympathies with, because of a very simple fact that the South is fighting to preserve their institution of slavery. And I want to be very clear on the History of Things podcast. This war was always fought over slavery. It was fought over the money. It was fought over I don't care what you want to attach to it. No slavery, no war. And by the time England and France are thinking about getting into this fight, the South has not really addressed what they want to do. You have a lot of lost cause stuff that'll tell you that, like, they put it in Gods and Generals, right? We should have freed the slaves and then fired on Fort Sumter. Like, in reality, guys, the Articles of Secession, the Cornerstone speeches, and the entire economy of the South is built on this institution. So there is only one singular reason. It doesn't matter if you attach an economic argument or whatever to it. It all boils down to one point, that we're fighting over the institution of slavery. And whatever you want to interpret that to be, we'll put that ball in your court. And I'm sure we're going to receive some hate mail and some stuff like that. And quite frankly, bring it on. Because A, I'm always up for discussion. And B, I got primary sources for days. So if you want to get into it, I hope you're coming with some primary sources too. Because A, that's the only way we'll learn something. And B, that's all we should really be focusing on. It's like conjecture, hearsay, pop culture, Gone with the Wind, movies. Like this is all crap. They're not historical record. Focus on the primary sources and historical record. And that leads us back to the point I was making of once England and France realize that this is a war that has now shifted towards something that they have already morally put to bed, they can't jump in on the side of a military and a government that hasn't put it to bed. And it's real simple. And for me, and I think you, Matt, and you can chime in or not about what you think on this matter, but Gettysburg loves to claim the high water mark of the Confederacy. And I think that this day we just talked about is the true high water mark of the Confederacy. Because while there are W's in the win column for the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia and out west, from this point and almost all the way up until the end of the war, these W's in the win column mean almost nothing because they don't actually move the needle away from the fact that you are now an isolated rebel army, totally blockaded in, getting no external help, and the army you're fighting against has every resource available to just perpetually engage in this war. And that's why we see this on Overland. Grant sort of figures all these things out in one stellar moment, and that's why it's so bloody, because Grant's like, I can waste anything I need to end this war. Men, horses, cannons, I don't give a crap. I've got so much of it that I just got to keep putting my foot on the gas, and this war will end soon. And that's why it does. I mean, it realistically ends. We get down to Petersburg, and we pussyfoot around in this siege, but once we break the siege, war over. And that's sort of where we're at. And once the Emancipation Proclamation is issued and it shifts us into this new, moral focus of the war and the politics that we're going to talk about in the next episode and stuff, we're all affected by it. You think about where we are in 2020, right? The end result of this war was we were able to pass the 13th Amendment, which ended the institution of slavery in this nation, but didn't solve civil rights and what that, what does all men are created equal mean? And I think that's something we're still struggling with today, but it pushed us forward. And then we ended up having to live through the Jim Crow era as a nation, but we moved forward. And then we got to the civil rights movement in the 1960s, but we have moved forward, and we're dealing with a lot of crazy stuff right now on civil rights levels. Some stuff that I thought our parents put to bed. You know what I mean? It's a weird world we're living in, but these are all a ripple effect, small pebble, big ripple effect of the Maryland campaign of 1862. And because the Battle of Antietam played out in such a way where we had a Union victory and Lincoln was able to issue this, this has to be the most important campaign of the war. Because the world we're living in today has a ton of freedom and equality that could not possibly have existed had we not started down this path. And it doesn't matter when we started down it, because the facts are the facts. We started down it right here. And that makes it monumentally important to me. And I don't care if that's real soapboxy or whatever. I just think it's a fact. This should never be taken lightly, and it should never be explored too much. You can't explore this too much. The gravity is so immense. So I think this was an awesome first episode. I think this was a great discussion. I think it's a good topic for your casual listener, because I think we covered things a little deeper than your average casual approach, but we weren't so overwhelming that it's hard to listen to. So I hope that you listeners out there enjoyed this as much as I did recording it with you guys. Kevin, I had a lot of fun with you, man.
I had fun. Thanks for having me.
We're going to do a follow-up here. One of the things that Matt and I are going to do in the first season here of History Things with Pat is in about a month and a half, we're going to record we're trying to keep it within an hour. But we're going to do a follow-up episode where we're going to, right now is where I'll put it out there. We all want you guys to send us your questions, comments, corrections, clarifications. I want to engage in a dialogue and a conversation with you guys. And what we want to do is not just have it be this private thing between us now that the podcast is out there and then we just privately email. We're going to come back and we'll record a follow-up. We'll address your stuff on the air, and we'll get into it again. And I would love to have you back, man. I had a ton of fun.
Yeah, I'd love to be back.
I'd love to get into this. Matt, any parting words before we get out of here, buddy?
Not so much, Pat. I think the points you made regarding this is the beginning of something larger for not only the war, but for the American experiment as a whole were poignant and right on the money. The emancipation is able to occur because of the Maryland Campaign, because of the Battle of Antietam. This is the turning point in the war. Definitely for me, my research, and a lot of my colleagues in the guides, this is the turning point of the war. Something that we wanted to emphasize with this podcast, with our inaugural podcast, to kind of set the stage, and had a lot of fun doing it. We're going to be hitting a lot of other historical topics, but I am looking forward to hearing some of the questions and comments from our listeners for that follow-up episode. So thank you very much for listening, gang.
Yeah, so to reach out to the History Things Podcast, you can email us at historythingspodcast@gmail.com. You can reach out to Matt Borders on Instagram at Matt Borders Books. Words are hard, my bad. That, once again, that is at Matt Borders Books. You can follow me on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram at History Things with Pat. And we look forward to being back here. Kevin, how do we get in touch with you, big guy, in case somebody's got a question for you directly?
Probably my blog, I guess. That'd be the best way. AntietamBrigades.blogspot.com.
You hear that? AntietamBrigades.blogspot.com. Go check out Kevin's work. Send him a message. Ask him a question. He's one of the most brilliant young minds we have in our little community here. We're hoping that this new wave of young historians really takes over the mantle from all the people we've learned from, and you're going to be front and center doing that, man. So you've done great work so far, and we look forward to what you got coming up. Speaking of what's coming up, we'll get out of here on that note. On episode 2, coming up next is going to feature Avery Lentz of the Battles and Banter podcast. Avery's a good friend of ours here, real good storyteller. He's a seasonal park ranger down at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Battlefield, so he's got a unique and professional experience telling the story that is Fredericksburg. So we look forward to having him on here. We're not always going to do timeline stuff on this show, but since we're just getting started and we're coming out of the gate, we wanted to start really strong.
Yeah, it was convenient to hit the Maryland campaign and Fredericksburg campaign right after, since we have the resources right here where we're at.
Yeah, just to do it. So we wanted just to come out swinging. And also, guys, we're not going to stick with the American Civil War. This is something that all three of us, and Matt and I, since we're going to be on every single episode of this show, this is something that is our wheelhouse. So again, we started in a space that is comfortable, but Matt and I do love to challenge ourselves. So we will be stepping outside of our comfort zone. We do have topics coming up that range from NASA. We're going to talk about some cool NASA stories. We're going to talk about transatlantic ocean travel, which is really cool. You'd be surprised how many little threads there are to pull on with things like that. And we'll talk about different wars. Like we'll talk about the Great War. At some point, I really want to talk about Vietnam, stuff like that. So, the History Things podcast is going to start in a place that you are familiar with. And pretty soon, I think our third episode, we're going to jump right out of the box and go somewhere new. So make sure you guys stay tuned. I thank you guys all for tuning in and listening to the first episode of the History Things podcast. For our guest, Kevin Pawlak, who, by the way, before we get out of here, man, Kevin Pawlak, I've seen all your movies. Huge fan. Just kidding. How often do you get that? Never? Often?
No, not often. I get Kevin Pawlak the chef and Kevin Pawlak the NHL referee.
Which I love that because we're both hockey guys.
Yeah.
But
I like the NHL referee one the best. I'll take that.
Yeah, that just shows our community guys. We as a community need to wake up. We're only watching war movies and war documentaries. If you're sitting out there going, who the hell is Kevin Pawlak the actor? Google him, and you're going to be like, duh, you've seen that guy in 20,000 movies. So I'm surprised that Kevin here doesn't get that more often. But in my world, man, you're the coolest Kevin Pawlak I know.
Oh, well, thank you.
So for our guest here, Kevin Pawlak, and my co-host here, Matt Borders, this is the History Things podcast. I'm your host, Pat McGuire, saying see you next time. Thanks, guys.